Chapter 12 of Behind the Scenes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. Chapter 12. Mrs. Lincoln Leaves the White House. For 5 weeks Mrs. Lincoln was confined to her room. Packing afforded quite a relief, as it so closely occupied us that we had not much time for lamentation. Letters of condolence were received from all parts of the country, and even from foreign potentates, but Mr. Andrew Johnson, the successor of Mr. Lincoln, never called on the widow, or even so much as wrote a line expressing sympathy for her grief and the loss of her husband. Robert called on him one day to tell him that his mother would turn the White House over to him in a few days, and he never even so much as inquired after their welfare. Mrs. Lincoln firmly believes that Mr. Johnson was concerned in the assassination plot. In packing, Mrs. Lincoln gave away everything intimately connected with the President, as she said that she could not bear to be reminded of the past. The articles were given to those who were regarded as the warmest of Mr. Lincoln's admirers. All of the presents passed through my hands. The dress that Mrs. Lincoln wore on the night of the assassination was given to Mrs. Slade, the wife of an old friend and faithful messenger. The cloak, stained with the President's blood, was given to me, as also was the bonnet worn on the same memorable night. Afterwards I received the comb and brush that Mr. Lincoln used during his residence at the White House. With this same comb and brush I had often combed his head. When almost ready to go down to a reception, he would turn to me with a quizzical look. "Well, Madam Elizabeth, will you brush my bristles down tonight?" "Yes, Mr. Lincoln." Then he would take his seat in an easy chair, and sit quietly while I arranged his hair. As may well be imagined, I was only too glad to accept this comb and brush from the hands of Mrs. Lincoln. The cloak, bonnet, comb, and brush, the glove worn at the first reception after the second inaugural, and Mr. Lincoln's overshoes also given to me, I have since donated for the benefit of Wilberforce University, a colored college near Xenia, Ohio, destroyed by fire on the night that the President was murdered. There was much surmise, when Mrs. Lincoln left the White House, what her 50 or 60 boxes, not to count her score of trunks, could contain. Had the government not been so liberal in furnishing the boxes, it is possible that there would have been less demand for so much transportation. The boxes were loosely packed, and many of them with articles not worth carrying away. Mrs. Lincoln had a passion for hoarding old things, believing, with Toodles, that they were handy to have about the house. The bonnets that she brought with her from Springfield, in addition to every one purchased during her residence in Washington, were packed in the boxes, and transported to Chicago. She remarked that she might find use for the material some day, and it was prudent to look to the future. I am sorry to say that Mrs. Lincoln's foresight in regard to the future was only confined to cast-off clothing, as she owed, at the time of the President's death, different store bills amounting to $70,000. Mr. Lincoln knew nothing of these bills, and the only happy feature of his assassination was that he died in ignorance of them. Had he known to what extent his wife was involved, the fact would have embittered the only pleasant moments of his life. I disclose this secret in regard to Mrs. Lincoln's debts, in order to explain why she would subsequently have labored under pecuniary embarrassment. The children, as well as herself, had received a vast number of presents during Mr. Lincoln's administration, and these presents constituted a large item in the contents of the boxes. The only article of furniture, so far as I know, taken away from the White House by Mrs. Lincoln, was a little dressing stand used by the President. I recollect hearing him say one day, "Mother, this little stand is so handy, and suits me so well, that I do not know how I shall get along without it when we move away from here." He was standing before a mirror, brushing his hair, when he made the remark. "Well, father," Mrs. Lincoln replied, "if you like the stand so well, we will take it with us when we go away." "Not for the world," he exclaimed. But she interrupted him. "I should like to know what difference it makes if we put a better one in its place." "That alters the question. If you will put a stand in its place worth twice as much as this one, and the Commissioner consents, then I have no objection." Mrs. Lincoln remembered these words, and with the consent of the Commissioner, took the stand to Chicago with her for the benefit of little Tad. Another stand, I must not forget to add, was put in its place. It is charged that a great deal of furniture was lost from the White House during Mr. Lincoln's occupation of it. Very true, and it can be accounted for in this way. In some respects, to put the case very plainly, Mrs. Lincoln was penny wise and pound foolish. When she moved into the White House, she discharged the steward, whose business it was to look after the affairs of the household. When the steward was dismissed, there was no one to superintend affairs, and the servants carried away many pieces of furniture. In this manner the furniture rapidly disappeared. Robert was frequently in the room where the boxes were being packed, and he tried without avail to influence his mother to set fire to her vast stores of old goods. "What are you going to do with that old dress, mother?" he would ask. "Never mind, Robert, I will find use for it. You do not understand this business. And what is more, I hope I never may understand it. I wish to heaven the car would take fire in which you place these boxes for transportation to Chicago, and burn all of your old plunder up." And then with an impatient gesture he would turn on his heel and leave the room. "Robert is so impetuous," his mother would say to me, after the closing of the door. "He never thinks about the future. Well, I hope he will get over his boyish notions in time." Many of the articles that Mrs. Lincoln took away from the White House were given, after her arrival in Chicago, for the benefit of charity fairs. At last everything was packed, and the day for departure for the West came. I can never forget that day. It was so unlike the day when the body of the President was borne from the hall in grand and solemn state. Then thousands gathered to bow the head in reverence as the plumed hearse drove down the line. There was all the pomp of military display, drooping flags, battalions with reversed arms, and bands playing dirge-like airs. Now the wife of the President was leaving the White House, and there was scarcely a friend to tell her good-bye. She passed down the public stairway, entered her carriage, and quietly drove to the depot, where we took the cars. The silence was almost painful. It had been arranged that I should go to Chicago. When Mrs. Lincoln first suggested her plan, I strongly objected, but I had been with her so long that she had acquired a great power over me. "I cannot go West with you, Mrs. Lincoln," I said when the idea was first advanced. "But you must go to Chicago with me, Elizabeth. I cannot do without you." "You forget my business, Mrs. Lincoln. I cannot leave it. Just now I have the spring trousseau to make for Mrs. Douglas, and I have promised to have it done in less than a week." "Never mind. Mrs. Douglas can get some one else to make her trousseau. You may find it to your interest to go. I am very poor now, but if Congress makes an appropriation for my benefit, you shall be well rewarded." "It is not the reward, but—" I commenced by way of reply, but she stopped me. "Now don't say another word about it if you do not wish to distress me. I have determined that you shall go to Chicago with me, and you must go." When Mrs. Douglas learned that Mrs. Lincoln wished me to accompany her West, she sent me word. "Never mind me. Do all you can for Mrs. Lincoln. My heart's sympathy is with her." Finding that no excuse would be accepted, I made preparations to go to Chicago with Mrs. Lincoln. The green car had specially been chartered for us, and in this we were conveyed to the West. Dr. Henry accompanied us, and he was remarkably attentive and kind. The first night out Mrs. Lincoln had a severe headache, and while I was bathing her temples, she said to me, "Lizabeth, you are my best and kindest friend, and I love you as my best friend. I wish it were in my power to make you comfortable for the balance of your days. If Congress provides for me, depend upon it, I will provide for you." The trip was devoid of interest. We arrived in Chicago without accident or delay, and apartments were secured for us at the Tremont House, where we remained 1 week. At the expiration of this time, Mrs. Lincoln decided that living at the hotel was attended with too much expense, so it was arranged that we should go to the country. Rooms were selected at Hyde Park, a summer resort. Robert and Tad accompanied their mother to Hyde Park. We arrived about 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Saturday. The place had just been opened the summer before, and there was a newness about everything. The accommodations were not first class, the rooms being small and plainly furnished. It was a lively day for us all. Robert occupied himself unpacking his books and arranging them on the shelves in the corner of his small but neat room. I assisted him, he talking pleasantly all the while. When we were through, he folded his arms, stood off a little distance from the mantel, with an abstracted look as if he were thinking of the great change in his fortunes, contrasting the present with the past. Turning to me, he asked, "Well, Mrs. Keckley, how do you like our new quarters?" "This is a delightful place, and I think you will pass your time pleasantly," I answered. He looked at me with a quizzical smile, then remarked, "You call it a delightful place. Well, perhaps it is. Since you do not have to stay here, you can safely say as much about the charming situation as you please. I presume that I must put up with it, as mother's pleasure must be consulted before my own. But candidly, I would almost as soon be dead as be compelled to remain 3 months in this dreary house." He seemed to feel what he said, and going to the window he looked out upon the view with moody countenance. I passed into Mrs. Lincoln's room and found her lying upon the bed, sobbing as if her heart would break. "What a dreary place, Lizzie, and to think that I should be compelled to live here, because I have not the means to live elsewhere. Ah, what a sad change has come to us all." I had listened to her sobbing for 8 weeks, therefore I was never surprised to find her in tears. Tad was the only cheerful one of the party. He was a child of sunshine, and nothing seemed to dampen the ardor of his spirits. Sunday was a very quiet day. I looked out of my window in the morning upon the beautiful lake that formed one of the most delightful views from the house. The wind was just strong enough to ripple the broad bosom of the water, and each ripple caught a jewel from the sunshine, and threw it sparkling up towards the sky. Here and there a sailboat silently glided into view, or sank below the faint blue line that marked the horizon, glided and melted away, like the spectral shadows that sometimes haunt the white snow-fields in the cold, tranquil light of a winter's moon. As I stood by my window that morning, looking out upon the lake, my thoughts were etherealized. The reflected sunbeams suggested visions of crowns studded with the jewels of eternal life, and I wondered how any one could call Hyde Park a dreary place. I had seen so much trouble in my life that I was willing to fold my arms and sink into a passive slumber anywhere, so the great longing of the soul was gratified. Rest. Robert spent the day in his room with his books, while I remained in Mrs. Lincoln's room talking with her, contrasting the present with the past, and drawing plans for the future. She held no communication, by letter or otherwise, with any of her relatives or old friends, saying that she wished to lead a secluded life for the summer. Old faces, she claimed, would only bring back memories of scenes that she desired to forget, and new faces, she felt assured, could not sympathize with her distress, or add to the comforts of her situation. On Monday morning, Robert was getting ready to ride into Chicago, as business called him to the city. "Where you goin', Brother Bob?" Tad generally called Robert Brother Bob. "Only into town," was the brief reply. "Mayn't I go with you?" "Ask mother. I think she will say no." Just then Mrs. Lincoln came in, and Tad ran to her, with the eager question, "Oh, Ma, can't I go to town with Brother Bob? I want to go so badly." "Go to town? No, you must stay and keep me company. Besides, I have determined that you shall get a lesson every day, and I am going to commence to-day with you." "I don't want to get a lesson. I won't get a lesson," broke in the impetuous boy. "I don't want to learn my book. I want to go to town." "I suppose you want to grow up to be a great dunce. Hush, Tad. You shall not go to town until you have said a lesson," and the mother looked resolute. "May I go after I learn my book?" was the next question. "Yes, if Robert will wait for you." "Oh, Bob will wait. Won't you, Bob?" "No, I cannot wait, but the landlord is going in this afternoon, and you can go with him. You must do as mother tells you, Tad. You are getting to be a big boy now, and must start to school next fall, and you would not like to go to school without knowing how to read." "Where's my book, Ma? Get my quick book. I will say my lesson." And he jumped about the room boisterously, boylike. "Be quiet, Tad. Here is your book, and we will now begin the first lesson," said his mother, as she seated herself in an easy-chair. Tad had always been much humored by his parents, especially by his father. He suffered from a slight impediment in his speech, and had never been able to go to school. Consequently his book knowledge was very limited. I knew that his education had been neglected, but had no idea he was so deficient as the first lesson at Hyde Park proved him to be. Drawing a low chair to his mother's side, he opened his book, and began to slowly spell the first word, A-P-E. "Well, what does A-P-E spell?" "Monkey," was the instant rejoinder. The word was illustrated by a small woodcut of an ape, which looked to Tad's eyes very much like a monkey, and his pronunciation was guided by the picture, and not by the sounds of the different letters. "Nonsense!" exclaimed his mother. "A-P-E does not spell monkey." "Does spell monkey. Isn't that a monkey?" and Tad pointed triumphantly to the picture. "No, it is not a monkey." "Not a monkey? What is it then?" "An ape." "An ape? 'Tain't an ape. Don't I know a monkey when I see it?" "No, if you say that is a monkey." "I do know a monkey. I've seen lots of them in the street with the organs. I know a monkey better than you do, 'cause I always go out into the street to see them when they come by, and you don't." "But, Tad, listen to me. An ape is a species of the monkey. It looks like a monkey, but it is not a monkey." "It shouldn't look like a monkey then. Here, Yib," he always called me Yib, "isn't this a monkey, and don't A-P-E spell monkey? Ma don't know anything about it." And he thrust his book into my face in an earnest, excited manner. I could not longer restrain myself, and burst out laughing. Tad looked very much offended, and I hastened to say, "I beg your pardon, Master Tad. I hope that you will excuse my want of politeness." He bowed his head in a patronizing way, and returned to the original question. "Isn't this a monkey? Don't A-P-E spell monkey?" "No, Tad, your mother is right. A-P-E spells ape." "You don't know as much as Ma. Both of you don't know anything," and Master Tad's eyes flashed with indignation. Robert entered the room, and the question was referred to him. After many explanations, he succeeded in convincing Tad that A-P-E does not spell monkey, and the balance of the lesson was got over with less difficulty. Whenever I think of this incident, I am tempted to laugh, and then it occurs to me that had Tad been a Negro boy, not the son of a president, and so difficult to instruct, he would have been called thick-skulled, and would have been held up as an example of the inferiority of race. I know many full Negro boys, able to read and write, who are not older than Tad Lincoln was when he persisted that A-P-E spelt monkey. Do not imagine that I desire to reflect upon the intellect of little Tad. Not at all. He is a bright boy, a son that will do honor to the genius and greatness of his father. I only mean to say that some incidents are about as damaging to one side of the question as to the other. If a colored boy appears dull, so does a white boy sometimes, and if a whole race is judged by a single example of apparent dullness, another race should be judged by a similar example. I returned to Washington with Mrs. Lincoln's best wishes for my success in business. The journey was devoid of incident. After resting a few days, I called at the White House and transacted some business for Mrs. Lincoln. I had no desire to enter the house, for everything about it bitterly reminded me of the past, and when I came out of the door, I hoped that I had crossed the threshold for the last time. I was asked by some of my friends if I had sent my business card to Mr. Johnson's family, and my answer was that I had not, and I had no desire to work for the President's family. Mr. Johnson was no friend to Mr. Lincoln, and he had failed to treat Mrs. Lincoln in the hour of her greatest sorrow with even common courtesy. Having promised to make a spring trousseau for Mrs. Senator Douglas as soon as I should return from Chicago, I called on her to meet the engagement. She appeared pleased to see me, and in greeting me asked, with evident surprise, "Why, Keckley," she always called me Keckley, "is this you? I did not know you were coming back. It was reported that you designed remaining with Mrs. Lincoln all summer." Mrs. Lincoln would have been glad to have kept me with her had she been able. Able? What do you mean by that? Simply this. Already she is laboring under pecuniary embarrassment, and was only able to pay my expenses and allow me nothing for my time. You surprise me. I thought she was left in good circumstances. So many think, it appears. Mrs. Lincoln, I assure you, is now practicing the closest economy. I must do something for myself, Mrs. Douglas, so I have come back to Washington to open my shop. The next day I collected my assistants, and my business went on as usual. Orders came in more rapidly than I could fill them. One day in the middle of the month of June, the girl who was attending the door came into the cutting room, where I was hard at work. "Mrs. Keckley, there is a lady below who wants to see you." "Who is she?" "I don't know. I did not learn her name." "Is her face familiar? Does she look like a regular customer?" "No, she is a stranger. I don't think she was ever here before. She came in an open carriage, with a black woman for an attendant." "It may be the wife of one of Johnson's new secretaries. Do go down, Mrs. Keckley," exclaimed my work girls in a chorus. I went below, and on entering the parlor a plainly dressed lady rose to her feet and asked, "Is this the dressmaker?" "Yes, I am the dressmaker." "Mrs. Keckley?" "Yes." "Mrs. Lincoln's former dressmaker, were you not?" "Yes, I worked for Mrs. Lincoln." "Are you very busy now?" "Very, indeed." "Can you do anything for me?" "That depends upon what is to be done, and when it is to be done." "Well, say one dress now, and several others a few weeks later." "I can make one dress for you now, but no more. I cannot finish the one for you in less than 3 weeks." "That will answer. I am Mrs. Patterson, the daughter of President Johnson. I expect my sister, Mrs. Stover, here in 3 weeks, and the dress is for her. We are both the same size, and you can fit the dress to me." The terms were satisfactorily arranged, and after measuring Mrs. Patterson, she bade me good morning, entered her carriage, and drove away. When I went upstairs into the workroom, the girls were anxious to learn who my visitor was. It was Mrs. Patterson, the daughter of President Johnson, I answered in response to several questions. "What! The daughter of our good Moses? Are you going to work for her?" "I have taken her order." "I fear that Johnson will prove a poor Moses, and I would not work for any of the family," remarked one of the girls. None of them appeared to like Mr. Lincoln's successor. I finished the dress for Mrs. Patterson, and it gave satisfaction. I afterwards learned that both Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Stover were kind-hearted, plain, unassuming women, making no pretensions to elegance. One day when I called at the White House, in relation to some work that I was doing for them, I found Mrs. Patterson busily at work with a sewing machine. The sight was a novel one to me for the White House. For as long as I remained with Mrs. Lincoln, I do not recollect ever having seen her with a needle in her hand. The last work done for the Johnsons by me were 2 dresses, one for each of the sisters. Mrs. Patterson subsequently wrote me a note, requesting me to cut and fit a dress for her, to which I replied that I never cut and fitted work to be made up outside of my workroom. This brought our business relations to an abrupt end. The months passed, and my business prospered. I continually received letters from Mrs. Lincoln, and as the anniversary of her husband's death approached, she wrote in a sadder strain. Before I left Chicago, she had exacted the promise that should Congress make an appropriation for her benefit, I must join her in the West, and go with her to visit the tomb of the President for the first time. The appropriation was made one of the conditions of my visit, for without relief from Congress she would be unable to bear my expenses. The appropriation was not made, and so I was unable to join Mrs. Lincoln at the appointed time. She wrote me that her plan was to leave Chicago in the morning with Tad, reach Springfield at night, stop at one of the hotels, drive out to Oak Ridge the next day, and take the train for Chicago the same evening, thus avoiding a meeting with any of her old friends. This plan, as she afterwards wrote me, was carried out. When the 2nd anniversary approached, President Johnson and party were swinging round the circle, and as they were to visit Chicago, she was especially anxious to be away from the city when they should arrive. Accordingly she hurried off to Springfield, and spent the time in weeping over the tomb where repose the hallowed ashes of her husband. During all this time I was asked many questions about Mrs. Lincoln, some prompted by friendship, but a greater number by curiosity. But my brief answers, I fear, were not always accepted as the most satisfactory. End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of Behind the Scenes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Beverly Scott. Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. Chapter 13. The origin of the rivalry between Mr. Douglas and Mr. Lincoln. Mrs. Lincoln, from her girlhood up, had an ambition to become the wife of a president. When a little girl, as I was told by one of her sisters, she was disposed to be a little noisy at times, and was self-willed. One day she was romping about the room, making more noise than the nerves of her grandmother could stand. The old lady looked over her spectacles and said in a commanding tone, "Sit down, Mary. Do be quiet. What on earth do you suppose will become of you if you go on this way?" "Oh, I will be the wife of a president some day," carelessly answered the petted child. Mrs. Lincoln, as Miss Mary Todd, was quite a belle in Springfield, Illinois, and from all accounts she was fond of flirting. She generally managed to keep a half-dozen gentlemen biting at the hook that she baited so temptingly for them. The world, if I mistake not, are not aware that the rivalry between Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Stephen A. Douglas commenced over the hand of Miss Mary Todd. The young lady was ambitious, and she smiled more sweetly upon Mr. Douglas and Mr. Lincoln than any of her other admirers, as they were regarded as rising men. She played her part so well that neither of the rivals for a long time could tell who would win the day. Mr. Douglas first proposed for her hand, and she discarded him. The young man urged his suit boldly. "Mary, you do not know what you are refusing. You have always had an ambition to become the wife of a President of the United States. Pardon the egotism, but I fear that in refusing my hand tonight you have thrown away your best chance to ever rule in the White House." "I do not understand you, Mr. Douglas." "Then I will speak more plainly. You know, Mary, that I am ambitious like yourself, and something seems to whisper in my ear, you will be President some day. Depend on it, I shall make a stubborn fight to win the proud position." "You have my best wishes, Mr. Douglas. Still I cannot consent to be your wife. I shall become Mrs. President, or I am the victim of false prophets, but it will not be as Mrs. Douglas. I have this little chapter in a romantic history from the lips of Mrs. Lincoln herself. At one of the receptions at the White House shortly after the first inauguration, Mrs. Lincoln joined in the promenade with Senator Douglas. He was holding a bouquet that had been presented to her, and as they moved along, he said, "Mary, it reminds me of old times to have you lean upon my arm." "You refer to the days of our youth. I must do you the credit, Mr. Douglas, to say that you were a gallant beau." "Not only a beau, but a lover. Do you remember the night our flirtation was brought to an end?" "Distinctly. You now see that I was right. I am Mrs. President, but not Mrs. Douglas." "True, you have reached the goal before me, but I do not despair. Mrs. Douglas, a nobler woman does not live, if I am spared, may possibly succeed you as Mrs. President." A few evenings after Mr. Douglas had been discarded, Mr. Lincoln made a formal proposal for the hand of Miss Todd, but it appears that the young lady was not willing to capitulate at once. She believed that she could send her lover adrift today and win him back tomorrow. "You are bold, Mr. Lincoln." "Love makes me bold." "You honor me, pardon me, but I cannot consent to be your wife." "Is this your final answer, Miss Todd?" And the suitor rose nervously to his feet. "I do not often jest, Mr. Lincoln. Why should I reconsider tomorrow my decision of today?" "Excuse me, your answer is sufficient. I was led to hope that I might become dearer to you than a friend, but the hope, it seems, has proved an idle one. I have the honor to say good night, Miss Todd." And pale yet calm, Mr. Lincoln bowed himself out of the room. He rushed to his office in a frantic state of mind. Dr. Henry, his most intimate friend, happened to come in, and was surprised to see the young lawyer walking the floor in an agitated manner. "What is the matter, Lincoln? You look desperate." "Matter? I am sick of the world. It is a heartless, deceitful world, and I care not how soon I am out of it." "You rave! What has happened? Have you been quarreling with your sweetheart?" "Quarrel! I wish to God it was a quarrel, for then I could look forward to reconciliation. The girl has refused to become my wife, after leading me to believe that she loved me. She is a heartless coquette." "Don't give up the conquest so easily. Cheer up, man, you may succeed yet. Perhaps she is only testing your love." "No, I believe that she is going to marry Douglas. If she does, I will blow my brains out." "Nonsense! That would not mend matters. Your brains were given to you for different use. Come, we will go to your room now. Go to bed and sleep on the question, and you will get up feeling stronger tomorrow." And Dr. Henry took the arm of his friend Lincoln, led him home, and saw him safely in bed. The next morning the doctor called at Mr. Lincoln's room, and found that his friend had passed a restless night. Excitement had brought on fever, which threatened to assume a violent form as the cause of the excitement still remained. Several days passed, and Mr. Lincoln was confined to his bed. Dr. Henry at once determined to call on Miss Todd and find out how desperate the case was. Miss Todd was glad to see him, and she was deeply distressed to learn that Mr. Lincoln was ill. She wished to go to him at once, but the doctor reminded her that she was the cause of his illness. She frankly acknowledged her folly, saying that she only desired to test the sincerity of Mr. Lincoln's love, that he was the idol of her heart, and that she would become his wife. The doctor returned with joyful news to his patient. The intelligence proved the best remedy for the disease. Mutual explanations followed, and in a few months Mr. Lincoln led Miss Todd to the altar in triumph. I learned these facts from Dr. Henry and Mrs. Lincoln. I believe them to be facts, and as such have recorded them. They do not agree with Mr. Herndon's story that Mr. Lincoln never loved but one woman, and that woman was Anne Rutledge. But then Mr. Herndon's story must be looked upon as a pleasant piece of fiction. When it appeared, Mrs. Lincoln felt shocked that one who pretended to be the friend of her dead husband should deliberately seek to blacken his memory. Mr. Lincoln was far too honest a man to marry a woman that he did not love. He was a kind and an indulgent husband, and when he saw faults in his wife, he excused them as he would excuse the impulsive acts of a child. In fact, Mrs. Lincoln was never more pleased than when the President called her his child wife. Before closing this rambling chapter, I desire to refer to another incident. After the death of my son, Miss Mary Welsh, a dear friend, one of my old St. Louis patrons, called to see me, and on broaching the cause of my grief, she condoled with me. She knew that I had looked forward to the day when my son would be a support to me, knew that he was to become the prop and mainstay of my old age, and knowing this, she advised me to apply for a pension. I disliked the idea very much and told her so. Told her that I did not want to make money out of his death. She explained away all of my objections, argued that Congress had made an appropriation for the specific purpose of giving a pension to every widow who should lose an only son in the war, and insisted that I should have my rights. She was so enthusiastic in the matter that she went to see Honorable Owen Lovejoy, then a member of the House from Illinois, and laid my case before him. Mr. Lovejoy was very kind, and said as I was entitled to the pension, I should have it, even if he had to bring the subject before Congress. I did not desire public agitation, and Mr. Lovejoy prepared my claim and laid it before the commissioners. In the meantime, he left Washington, and Mr. Joseph Lovejoy, his brother, prosecuted the claim for me, and finally succeeded in securing me a pension of $8 per month. Mr. Joseph Lovejoy was inclined to the Democratic party, and he pressed my claim with great earnestness. He hoped that the claim would not be allowed, as he said the rejection of it would make capital for his party. Nevertheless, the pension was granted, and I am none the less thankful to Mr. Joseph Lovejoy for his kindness to me and interest in my welfare. End of chapter 13. Recording by Beverly Scott, Camden, Maine.
Chapter 14 of Behind the Scenes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Becky Cook. Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. Chapter 14. Old Friends. In order to introduce a pleasant chapter of my life, I must take a slight retrospective glance. Mrs. Ann Garland, the mistress from whom I purchased my freedom in St. Louis, had 5 daughters, all lovely, attractive girls. I used to take pride in dressing the 2 eldest, Miss Mary and Miss Carrie, for parties. Though the family labored under pecuniary embarrassment, I worked for these 2 young girls, and they were always able to present a good appearance in society. They were much admired, and both made the best matches of the season. Miss Mary married Dr. Pappan, and Miss Carrie Dr. John Farrow. I loved them both tenderly, and they were warmly attached to me. Both are now dead, and when the death film was gathering in their eyes, each called for me and asked to die in my arms. Miss Carrie did not long survive a sister, and I wept many tears over the deathbeds of the 2 lovely flowers that had blossomed so sweetly beneath my eyes. Each breathed her last in the arms that had sheltered them so often in the bright, rosy period of life. My mother took care of my son, and Miss Nannie Garland, the 4th daughter, when a wee thing, became my especial charge. She slept in my bed, and I watched over her as if she had been my own child. She called me Yiddy, and I could not have loved her more tenderly had she been the sister of my unfortunate boy. She was about 12 years old when I purchased my freedom, and resigned my charge to other hands. After Mr. Garland's death, the widow moved to Vicksburg, Mississippi, and I lost sight of the family for a few years. My mother accompanied them to Vicksburg, where she died. I made 2 visits to Vicksburg as a free woman, the object of my second visit being to look after the few effects left by my mother. As I did not visit my mother's grave at the time, the Garlands were much surprised, but I offered no explanation. The reason is not difficult to understand. My mother was buried in a public ground, and the marks of her grave, as I learned, were so obscure that the spot could not be readily designated. To look upon a grave and not feel certain whose ashes repose beneath the sod is painful, and the doubt which mystifies you weakens the force, if not the purity, of the love offering from the heart. Memory preserved a sunny picture of my mother's face, and I did not wish to weave somber threads suggestive of a deserted graveyard into it, and thus impair its beauty. After spending a few weeks with the family, I returned to St. Louis, and then came North. The war broke out, and I lost all trace of the Garlands. Often during my residence in Washington, I recalled the past, and wondered what had become of those who claimed my first duty and my first love. When I would mention their names and express interest in their welfare, my Northern friends would roll up their eyes in surprise. "Why, Lizzie, how can you have a kind thought for those who inflicted a terrible wrong upon you, by keeping you in bondage?" they would ask. "You forget that the past is dear to everyone, for to the past belongs that golden period, the days of childhood. The past is a mirror that reflects the chief incidents of my life. To surrender it is to surrender the greatest part of my existence, early impressions, friends, and the graves of my father, my mother, and my son. These people are associated with everything that memory holds dear, and so long as memory proves faithful, it is but natural that I should sigh to see them once more. But they have forgotten you. They are too selfish to give a single thought to you, now that you no longer are their slave." "Perhaps so, but I cannot believe it. You do not know the Southern people as well as I do, how warm is the attachment between master and slave." My Northern friends could not understand the feeling, therefore explanation was next to useless. They would listen with impatience, and remark at the close with a shrug of the shoulders, "You have some strange notions, Lizzie." In the fall of 1865 a lady called on me at my apartments in Washington. Her face looked familiar, but I could not place her. When I entered the room she came towards me eagerly. "You are surprised to see me, I know. I am just from Lynchburg, and when I left Cousin Ann I promised to call and see you if I came to Washington. I am here, you see, according to promise." I was more bewildered than ever. "Cousin Ann, pardon me. Oh, I see you do not recognize me. I am Mrs. General Longstreet, but you knew me when I was a girl as Bettie Garland." "Bettie Garland! And is this indeed you?" I am so glad to see you. Where does Miss Anne live now? I always called my last mistress Miss Anne. I thought you could not forget old friends. Cousin Ann is living in Lynchburg. All the family are in Virginia. They moved to the old state during the war. Fanny is dead. Nanny has grown into a woman and is married to General Meem. Hugh was killed in the war, and now only Spot, Maggie, and Nanny are left. Fanny dead, and poor Hugh. You bring sad news as well as pleasant. And so my little pet is married. I can hardly believe it. She was only a child when I saw her last. Yes, Nanny is married to a nobleman. General Meem belongs to one of the best families in Virginia. They are now living at Rude's Hill, up beyond Winchester, in the Shenandoah Valley. All of them want to see you very badly. I should be delighted to go to them. Miss Betty, I can hardly realize that you are the wife of General Longstreet, and just think, you are now sitting in the very chair and the very room where Mrs. Lincoln has often sat." She laughed. "The change is a great one, Lizzie. We little dream to day what to morrow will bring forth. Well, we must take a philosophical view of life. After fighting so long against the Yankees, General Longstreet is now in Washington suing for pardon, and we propose to live in peace with the United States again." I had many questions to ask her about old friends, and the time passed rapidly. She greeted me with the frankness that she had always extended to me, and I was transported to days of the long ago. Her stay in Washington, D.C., was brief, as the General arranged his business, and they left the capital the next day. Mrs. Longstreet gave me the Garlands' address, and I wrote to them expressing the hope that I would be able to see them before long. In reply came letters full of tender sympathy and affection. In the winter of 1865, Miss Nanny wrote to me that she had the best husband in the world, that they designed going to housekeeping in the spring, and that they would be glad to have me make them a visit in July, 1866. She sent me a pressing invitation. "You must come to me, dear Lizzie," she wrote. "We are now living at Rude's Hill. I am dying to see you. Ma, Maggie, Spot, and Minnie, sister Mary's child, are with me, and you are only needed to make the circle complete. Come, I will not take no for an answer." I was anxious to go myself, and when I received the urgent invitation I concluded to go at once, and I wrote them to expect me in August. On the 10th of August I left Washington for Virginia, taking the train for Harper's Ferry. The journey was attended with several disappointments. We arrived at Harper's Ferry in the night, and being asleep at the time, I was carried to the station beyond, where I had to wait and take the return train. After returning to Harper's Ferry, where I changed cars for Winchester, I missed the train and was detained another day. From Winchester the only way to reach Rude's Hill was by a line of stages. We commenced the weary drive in the evening and rode all night. A young gentleman in the stage said that he knew General Meem well, and that he would tell me when we reached the place. Relying upon him, I went to sleep, and it appears that the polite young gentleman followed my example. About 4 o'clock in the morning, one of the passengers shook me and asked, "Auntie, don't you want to get out at Rude's Hill?" I started, rubbing my eyes. "Yes, are we there?" "More than there, we've passed it." "Passed it?" "Yes, it's 6 miles back. You should not sleep so soundly, Auntie. Why did you not tell me sooner? I am so anxious to be there." "Fact is, I forgot it. Never mind. Get out at this village, and you can find conveyance back." The village, New Market, was in a dilapidated condition. Everything about it spoke plainly of the sad destruction of war. Getting out of the stage, I went into a house by courtesy named a hotel, where I obtained a cup of coffee. "Is there no conveyance from here to Rude's Hill?" I asked. "Yes, the stage returns this evening," answered the landlord. "This evening? I want to go as soon as possible. I should die if I had to stay all day in this lonely place." A colored man behind the bar, seeing how earnest I was, came forward, and informed me that he would drive me over to General Meem's place in an hour. This was joyful news, and I urged him to get ready to start as soon as possible. While standing in the door of the hotel, impatiently waiting for my colored friend to drive round with his little wagon, a fat old lady waddled across the street and greeted me. "Ain't you Lizzie?" "Yes," I answered, surprised that she should know my name. "I thought so. They have been expecting you at Rude's Hill every day for 2 weeks, and they do but little but talk about you. Mrs. Meem was in town yesterday, and she said that she expected you this week, certain. They will be mighty glad to see you. Why, will you believe it? They actually have kept a light burning in the front window every night for 10 nights, in order that you might not go by the place should you arrive in the night. Thank you. It is pleasant to know that I'm expected. I fell asleep in the stage and failed to see the light, so am here instead of at Rude's Hill." Just then the colored man drove up with a wagon, and I got in with him, and was soon on the road to General Meem's country seat. As we drove up to Rude's Hill, I observed a young man standing in the yard, and believing it to be Spot, whom I had not seen for 8 years, I beckoned to him. With an exclamation of joy he came running towards me. His movements attracted the attention of the family, and in a minute the door was crowded with anxious, inquiring faces. "It is Lizzie! It is Lizzie!" was a happy cry from all parties. In my eagerness to get to them, I stepped from the wagon to the top of the stile, intending to make a triumphant leap into the yard. But alas, my exultation was brief. My hoop skirt caught on one of the posts, and I fell sprawling into the yard. Spot reached me first and picked me up, only to put me into the arms of Miss Nannie, her sister Maggie, and Mrs. Garland. Could my friends of the North have seen that meeting, they would never have doubted again that the mistress had any affection for her former slave. I was carried to the house in triumph. In the parlor I was divested of my things, and placed in an easy chair before a bright fire. The servants looked on in amazement. "Lizzie, you are not changed a bit. You look as young as when you left us in St. Louis years ago," and Mrs. Meem, my foster child, kissed me again. "Here, Lizzie, this is Minnie Pappan's sister Mary's child. Hasn't she grown?" and Miss Maggie led a tall, queenly lady up to me. "Minnie! Poor dear Miss Mary's child! I can hardly believe it. She was only a baby when I saw her last. Makes me feel so old to see how large she has grown. Miss Minnie, you are larger than your mother was, your dear mother whom I held in my arms when she died," and I brushed a tear from each of my eyes. "Have you had your breakfast, Lizzie?" asked Miss Garland. "No, she has not!" exclaimed her children in a chorus. "I will get breakfast for her," and Nannie, Maggie, and Minnie started for the kitchen. "It is not necessary that all should go," said Mrs. Garland. "Here is the cook. She will get breakfast ready." But the 3 did not heed her. All rushed into the kitchen, and soon brought me a nice hot breakfast. While I was eating, the cook remarked, "I declare, I never did see people carry on so. Wonder if I should go off instead 2 or 3 years, if all of you would hug and kiss me so when I come back." After I had finished my breakfast, General Meem came in. He greeted me warmly. "Lizzie, I am very glad to see you. I feel that you are an old acquaintance. I have heard so much of you through my wife, her sister, and her mother. Welcome to Rude's Hill." I was much pleased with his appearance, and closer acquaintance proved him to be a model gentleman. Rude's Hill, during the war, was once occupied by General Stonewall Jackson for his headquarters, which gave more than ordinary interest to the place. The location was delightful, but the marks of war could be seen everywhere on the plantation. General Meem was engaged in planting, and he employed a large number of servants to assist him in his work. About a mile from Rude's Hill was Mount Airy, the elegant country seat of the General's brother. The 2 families visited each other a great deal, and as both entertained plenty of company, the autumn months passed pleasantly. I was comfortably quartered at Rude's Hill, and was shown every attention. We sewed together, talking of old times, and every day either drove out or rode on horseback. The room in which I sat in the daytime was the room that General Jackson always slept in, and people came from afar and near to look at it. General Jackson was the ideal soldier of the Southern people, and they worshipped him as an idol. Every visitor would tear a splinter from the walls or windows of the room, to take away and treasure as a priceless relic. It did not take me long to discover that I was an object of great curiosity in the neighborhood. My association with Mrs. Lincoln, and my attachments for the Garlands, whose slave I had once been, clothed me with romantic interest. Colonel Harry Gilmore, well known as a partisan leader in Maryland and Virginia during the war, was a frequent visitor at Mount Airy and Rude's Hill. One day I accompanied a party to a tournament, and General Meem laughed pleasantly over the change that had come to me in so short a time. "Why, Lizzie, You are riding with Colonel Gilmore. Just think of the change from Lincoln to Gilmore. It sounds like a dream, but then the change is an evidence of the peaceful feeling of this country. A change, I trust, that augurs brighter days for us all. I had many long talks with Mrs. Garland, in one of which I asked what had become of the only sister of my mother, formerly a maid to Mrs. G.'s mother. "She is dead, Lizzie, have been dead for some years. A maid in the old time meant something different from what we understand by a maid at the present time. Your aunt used to scrub the floor and milk a cow now and then, as well as attend to the orders of my mother. My mother was severe with her slaves in some respects, but then her heart was full of kindness. She had your aunt punished one day, and not liking her sorrowful look, she made 2 extravagant promises in order to effect a reconciliation, both of which were accepted, on condition that her maid would look cheerful, and be good and friendly with her. The mistress told her she might go to church the following Sunday, and that she would give her a silk dress to wear on the occasion. Now my mother had but one silk dress in the world, silk not being so plenty in those days as it is now, and yet she gave this dress to her maid to make friends with her. 2 weeks afterward mother was sent for to spend the day at a neighbor's house, and on inspecting her wardrobe discovered that she had no dress fit to wear in company. She had but one alternative, and that was to appeal to the generosity of your Aunt Charlotte. Charlotte was summoned, and enlightened in regard to the situation. The maid proffered to loan the silk dress to her mistress for the occasion, and the mistress was only too glad to accept. She made her appearance at the social gathering, duly arrayed in the silk that her maid had worn to church on the preceding Sunday. We laughed over the incident, when Mrs. Garland said, "Lizzie, during the entire war I used to think of you every day, and have longed to see you so much. When we heard you were with Mrs. Lincoln, the people used to tell me that I was foolish to think of ever seeing you again, that your head must be completely turned. But I knew your heart, and I could not believe that you would forget us. I always argued that you would come and see us some day. You judged me rightly, Miss Anne. How could I forget you whom I had grown up with from infancy? Northern people used to tell me that you would forget me, but I told them I knew better, and hoped on. Ah, love is too strong to be blown away like gossamer threads. The chain is strong enough to bind life even to the world beyond the grave. Do you always feel kindly towards me, Lizzie? To tell you candidly, Miss Anne, I have but one unkind thought, and that is, you did not give me the advantages of a good education. What I have learned has been the study of after years. You are right, I did not look at things then as I do now. I have always regretted that you were not educated when a girl, but you have not suffered much on this score, since you get along in the world better than we who enjoyed every educational advantage in childhood. I remained 5 weeks at Rude's Hill, and they were 5 of the most delightful weeks of my life. I designed going direct to Richmond, but the cholera was reported to be raging in that city, so I took the train for Baltimore. In Baltimore I stopped with Mrs. Annette Jordan. Mrs. Garland had given me a letter to Mrs. Douglas Gordon, who introduced me to several Baltimore ladies, among others Mrs. Dr. Thomas, who said to me with tears in her eyes, "Lizzie, you deserve to meet with success for having been so kind to our friends in the days of the past. I wish there was more women in the world like you. I will always do what little I can to promote your welfare." After remaining in Baltimore a few days, I came to the conclusion that I could do better in Washington, so I returned to the capital and reopened my business. In the spring of 1867 Miss Maggie Garland paid a visit to Baltimore. Before leaving Virginia, she said to some of her friends in Lynchburg that she designed going by Washington to see Lizzie. Her friends ridiculed the idea, but she persisted. "I love Lizzie next to mother. She has been mother to us all. Half the pleasure of my visit is that I will be able to see her." She wrote me a letter saying that she designed visiting me, asking if it would be agreeable. I replied, "Yes, come by all means. I shall be so glad to see you." She came and stayed at my rooms, and expressed surprise to find me so comfortably fixed. I cannot do better than conclude this chapter with 2 letters from my dear young friends, the first from Mrs. General Meem, and the second from Miss Maggie Garland. These letters show the goodness of their hearts and the frankness of their natures. I trust that they will not object to the publicity that I give them. Rude's Hill, September 14th, 1867. My dear Lizzie, I am nearly ashamed of myself for neglecting to acknowledge the receipt of your letter, and the very acceptable box of patterns some weeks ago. But you will pardon my remissness, I know, for you can imagine what a busy time I've had all summer, with a house full of company most of the time, and with very inefficient servants, and in some departments none at all. So I have had to be at times dining room servant, housemaid, and the last and most difficult, dairymaid. But I have turned the department over to our gardener, who, though as green at the business as myself, seems willing to learn, and has been doing the milking all summer. These are a few of the reasons why I have not written to you before, for I hope you will always believe that you occupy a large place in my memory and affection, whether I write to you or not, and such a poor correspondent as yourself ought not to complain. Mother, Mag, Uncle John, and Spot are still with us. The former will pass the winter with me, but the others all talk of leaving before long. The approach of winter always scatters our guests, and we have to spend the long, dreary winters alone. But we are to have the railroad to Mount Jackson by Christmas, perhaps sooner, and then if we can raise the wind, we can spend a portion of the winter in the city, and I hope you will find time to come up and spend the day with me, as we will be near neighbors. I so seldom indulge in the pleasant task of writing letters that I scarcely know what will interest my correspondent, but I flatter myself that you will be glad to hear anything and everything about us all. So I'll begin with the children. Hugh has improved a great deal, and is acknowledged to be the smartest child and the finest looking in the state. He talks as plainly as I do, and just as understandingly as a child of 10 years old. His nurse often says we need not set our hearts on that child. He is too smart ever to be raised. But I trust his badness will save him, for he is terribly spoiled, as such interesting children are bound to be. Miss Eliza, no longer called Jane, is getting to be a little star girl, as her papa calls her. She is just learning to walk, and says a good many words quite plainly. You would never take her for the same little cry baby of last summer, and she is a little beauty too, as white as the driven snow, with the most beautiful blue eyes and long dark lashes you ever saw. She will set somebody crazy if she grows up to be as lovely as she now promises to be. My dear husband has been, like myself, run to death this summer, but it agrees with him, and I never saw him looking better. He has fallen off a little, which is a great improvement, I think. He often speaks of you, and wonders if you were sufficiently pleased with your visit last summer to repeat it. I hope so, for we will always be glad to welcome you to Rude's Hill, whenever you have time to come, provided, of course, you have the wish also. Spot expects to hang out on his shingle in St. Louis next winter. His health is greatly improved, though he is still very thin, and very, very much like our dear father. Mag has promised to teach a little cousin of ours who lives in Nelson County until February, and will leave here in 2 weeks to commence her labors. I hate to see her leave, but she is bent on it, and her winters are so unattractive that I do not like to insist on her shutting herself up all winter with 3 old people. She will have very pleasant society at Cousin Buller's, and will perhaps spend the rest of the winter with Aunt Pris, if Uncle Armistead remains in Binghamton, New York, as he talks of doing. Do write to me before you get too busy with your fall and winter work. I am so anxious to hear all your plans, and about your stay in New York. By the by, I will have to direct this to Washington, as I do not know your New York address. I suppose your friends will forward it. If you are going to remain any length of time in New York, send me your address, and I will write again. I have somehow made out a long letter, though there is not much in it, and I hope you will do the same before long. All send love. Yours affectionately, N.R.G. Meme. Addendum. My pen and ink are both so wretched that I fear you will find some difficulty in making out this scratch, but put on your specs, and what you can't read just guess at. I enclose a very poor likeness of Hugh taken last spring. Don't show it to anybody, for I assure you there is scarcely the faintest resemblance to him now in it. N.R.G.M. I give only a few extracts from the pleasant letter from Miss Maggie Garland. The reader will observe she signed herself, "Your child Mag," an expression of love warmly appreciated by me. Cetus, December 17th, 1867. So many months have passed, my dear Lizzie, since I was cheered by a sight of your welcome handwriting, that I must find out what is the matter, and see if I can't persuade you to write me a few lines. Whatever comes, weal or woe, you know I shall always love you, and I have no idea of letting you forget me. So just make up your mind to write me a nice long letter, and tell me what you are doing with yourself this cold weather. I am buried in the wilds of Amherst, and the cold chilling blasts of December come whistling round, and tell us plainly that the reign of the Snow King has begun in good earnest. Since October I have been teaching for my cousin, Mr. Claiborne, and although I am very happy, and everyone is so kind to me, I shall not be sorry when the day comes when I shall shut up school books forever. None of Miss Ann's children were cut out for schoolmarms, were they, Yiddy? I am sure I was only made to ride in my carriage and play on the piano. Don't you think so? You must write me where you are, so I can stop and see you on my way north, for you know, dear Lizzie, no one can take your place in my heart. I expect to spend the Christmas holidays in Lynchburg. It will be very gay there, and I will be glad enough to take a good dance. This is a short letter to send you after such a long silence, but 'tis too cold to write. Let me hear from you very soon. Your child, Mag. Please write, for I long to hear from you. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15, Part 1 of Behind the Scenes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bridget Gage. Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. Chapter 15, Part 1. Secret History of Mrs. Lincoln's Wardrobe in New York. In March, 1867, Mrs. Lincoln wrote to me from Chicago that, as her income was insufficient to meet her expenses, she would be obliged to give up her house in the city and return to boarding. She said that she had struggled long enough to keep up appearances, and that the mask must be thrown aside. "I have not the means," she wrote, "to meet the expenses of even a first-class boarding-house, and must sell out and secure cheap rooms at some place in the country. It will not be startling news to you, my dear Lizzie, to learn that I must sell a portion of my wardrobe to add to my resources, so as to enable me to live decently; for you remember what I told you in Washington, as well as what you understood before you left me here in Chicago. I cannot live on $1,700 a year, and as I have many costly things which I shall never wear, I might as well turn them into money, and thus add to my income and make my circumstances easier. It is humiliating to be placed in such a position, but as I am in the position, I must extricate myself as best I can. Now, Lizzie, I want to ask a favor of you. It is imperative that I should do something for my relief, and I want you to meet me in New York, between the 30th of August and the 5th of September next, to assist me in disposing of a portion of my wardrobe." I knew that Mrs. Lincoln's income was small, and also knew that she had many valuable dresses, which could be of no value to her, packed away in boxes and trunks. I was confident that she would never wear the dresses again, and thought that, since her need was urgent, it would be well enough to dispose of them quietly, and believed that New York was the best place to transact a delicate business of the kind. She was the wife of Abraham Lincoln, the man who had done so much for my race, and I could refuse to do nothing for her calculated to advance her interests. I consented to render Mrs. Lincoln all the assistance in my power, and many letters passed between us in regard to the best way to proceed. It was finally arranged that I should meet her in New York about the middle of September. While thinking over this question, I remembered an incident of the White House. When we were packing up to leave Washington for Chicago, she said to me one morning, "Lizzie, I may see the day when I shall be obliged to sell a portion of my wardrobe. If Congress does not do something for me, then my dresses some day may have to go to bring food into my mouth and the mouths of my children." I also remembered of Mrs. L. having said to me at different times, in the years of 1863 and 4, that her expensive dresses might prove of great assistance to her some day. "In what way, Mrs. Lincoln? I do not understand," I ejaculated, the first time she made the remark to me. "Very simple to understand. Mr. Lincoln is so generous that he will not save anything from his salary, and I expect that we will leave the White House poorer than when we came into it. And, should such be the case, I will have no further need for an expensive wardrobe, and it will be policy to sell it off." I thought at the time that Mrs. Lincoln was borrowing trouble from the future, and little dreamed that the event which she so dimly foreshadowed would ever come to pass. I closed my business about the 10th of September, and made every arrangement to leave Washington on the mission proposed. On the 15th of September I received a letter from Mrs. Lincoln, postmarked Chicago, saying that she should leave the city so as to reach New York on the night of the 17th, and directing me to precede her to the metropolis, and secure rooms for her at the St. Denis Hotel, in the name of Mrs. Clark, as her visit was to be incog. The contents of the letter were startling to me. I had never heard of the St. Denis, and therefore presumed that it could not be a first-class house, and I could not understand why Mrs. Lincoln should travel, without protection, under an assumed name. I knew that it would be impossible for me to engage rooms at a strange hotel for a person whom the proprietors knew nothing about. I could not write to Mrs. Lincoln, since she would be on the road to New York before a letter could possibly reach Chicago. I could not telegraph her, for the business was of too delicate a character to be trusted to the wires that would whisper the secret to every curious operator along the line. In my embarrassment, I caught at a slender thread of hope, and tried to derive consolation from it. I knew Mrs. Lincoln to be indecisive about some things, and I hoped that she might change her mind in regard to the strange programme proposed, and at the last moment dispatch me to this effect. The 16th and then the 17th of September passed, and no dispatch reached me, so on the 18th I made all haste to take the train for New York. After an anxious ride, I reached the city in the evening, and when I stood alone in the streets of the great metropolis, my heart sank within me. I was in an embarrassing situation, and scarcely knew how to act. I did not know where the St. Denis Hotel was, and was not certain that I should find Mrs. Lincoln there after I should go to it. I walked up to Broadway, and got into a stage going up town, with the intention of keeping a close lookout for the hotel in question. A kind-looking gentleman occupied the seat next to me, and I ventured to inquire of him, "If you please, sir, can you tell me where the St. Denis Hotel is?" "Yes, we ride past it in the stage. I will point it out to you when we come to it." "Thank you, sir." The stage rattled up the street, and after a while the gentleman looked out of the window and said, "This is the St. Denis. Do you wish to get out here?" "Thank you, yes, sir." He pulled the strap, and the next minute I was standing on the pavement. I pulled a bell at the ladies' entrance to the hotel, and a boy coming to the door, I asked, "Is a lady by the name of Mrs. Clark stopping here? She came last night, I believe." "I do not know. I will ask at the office," and I was left alone. The boy came back and said, "Yes, Mrs. Clark is here. Do you want to see her?" "Yes." "Well, just walk round there. She is down here now." I did not know where "round there" exactly was, but I concluded to go forward. I stopped, however, thinking that the lady might be in the parlor with company, and pulling out a card, asked the boy to take it to her. She heard me talking, and came into the hall to see herself. "My dear Lizzie, I am so glad to see you!" she exclaimed, coming forward and giving me her hand. "I have just received your note. I had written her that I should join her on the 18th, and have been trying to get a room for you. Your note has been here all day, but it was never delivered until to-night. Come in here until I find out about your room." And she led me into the office. The clerk, like all modern hotel clerks, was exquisitely arrayed, highly perfumed, and too self-important to be obliging, or even courteous. "This is the woman I told you about. I want a good room for her," Mrs. Lincoln said to the clerk. "We have no room for her, madam," was the pointed rejoinder. "But she must have a room. She is a friend of mine, and I want a room for her adjoining mine." "We have no room for her on your floor." "That is strange, sir. I tell you that she is a friend of mine, and I am sure you could not give a room to a more worthy person." "Friend of yours or not, I tell you we have no room for her on your floor. I can find a place for her on the 5th floor." That, sir, I presume, will be a vast improvement on my room. Well, if she goes to the 5th floor, I shall go too, sir. What is good enough for her is good enough for me." "Very well, madam. Shall I give you adjoining rooms, and send your baggage up?" "Yes, and have it done in a hurry. Let the boy show us up. Come, Elizabeth." And Mrs. L. turned from the clerk with a haughty glance, and we commenced climbing the stairs. I thought we should never reach the top, and when we did reach the 5th story, what accommodations! Little 3-cornered rooms, scantily furnished. I never expected to see the widow of President Lincoln in such dingy, humble quarters. "How provoking!" Mrs. Lincoln exclaimed, sitting down on a chair when we had reached the top, and panting from the effects of the climbing. "I declare, I never saw such unaccommodating people. Just to think of them sticking us away up here in the attic! I will give them a regular going over in the morning." "But you forget. They do not know you. Mrs. Lincoln would be treated differently from Mrs. Clark." "True, I do forget. Well, I suppose I shall have to put up with the annoyances. Why did you not come to me yesterday, Lizzie? I was almost crazy when I reached here last night and found you had not arrived. I sat down and wrote you a note, I felt so badly, imploring you to come to me immediately. This note was afterwards sent to me from Washington. It reads as follows: St. Denis Hotel, Broadway, New York, Wednesday, September 17th. My dear Lizzie, I arrived here last evening in utter despair at not finding you. I am frightened to death, being here alone. Come, I pray you, by the next train. Inquire for Mrs. Clark, room 94, 5th or 6th story. House so crowded, could not get another spot. I wrote you especially to meet me here last evening. It makes me wild to think of being here alone. Come by next train, without fail. Your friend, Mrs. Lincoln. I am booked Mrs. Clark. Inquire for no other person. Come, come, come. I will pay your expenses when you arrive here. I shall not leave here or change my room until you come. Your friend, M. L. Do not leave this house without seeing me. Come. I transcribed the letter literally. In reply to Mrs. Lincoln's last question, I explained what has already been explained to the reader, that I was in hopes she would change her mind, and knew that it would be impossible to secure the rooms requested for a person unknown to the proprietors or attachés of the hotel. The explanation seemed to satisfy her. Turning to me suddenly, she exclaimed, "You have not had your dinner, Lizzie, and must be hungry. I nearly forgot about it in the joy of seeing you. You must go down to the table right away." She pulled the bell rope, and a servant appearing, she ordered him to give me my dinner. I followed him downstairs, and he led me into the dining hall, and seated me at a table in one corner of the room. I was giving my order, when the steward came forward and gruffly said, "You are in the wrong room." "I was brought here by the waiter," I replied. "It makes no difference. I will find you another place where you can eat your dinner." I got up from the table and followed him, and when outside of the door said to him, "It is very strange that you should permit me to be seated at the table in the dining room only for the sake of ordering me to leave it the next moment." "Are you not Mrs. Clark's servant?" was his abrupt question. "I am with Mrs. Clark." "It is all the same. Servants are not allowed to eat in the large dining room. Here, this way. You must take your dinner in the servants' hall." Hungry and humiliated as I was willing to follow to any place to get my dinner, for I had been riding all day, and had not tasted a mouthful since early morning. On reaching the servants' hall, we found the door of the room locked. The waiter left me standing in the passage while he went to inform the clerk of the fact. In a few minutes the obsequious clerk came blustering down the hall. "Did you come out from the street, or from Mrs. Clark's room?" "From Mrs. Clark's room," I meekly answered. My gentle words seemed to quiet him, and then he explained, "It is after the regular hour for dinner. The room is locked up, and Annie has gone out with the key." My pride would not let me stand longer in the hall. "Very well," I remarked, as I began climbing the stairs. "I will tell Mrs. Clark that I cannot get any dinner." He looked after me, with a scowl on his face. "You need not put on airs. I understand the whole thing." I said nothing, but continued to climb the stairs, thinking to myself, well, if you understand the whole thing, it is strange that you should put the widow of ex-President Abraham Lincoln in a three-cornered room in the attic of this miserable hotel. When I reached Mrs. Lincoln's rooms, tears of humiliation and vexation were in my eyes. "What is the matter, Lizzie?" she asked. "I cannot get any dinner." "Cannot get any dinner? What do you mean?" I told her of all that had transpired below. "The insolent, overbearing people!" she fiercely exclaimed. "Never mind, Lizzie, you shall have your dinner. Put on your bonnet and shawl." "What for?" "What for? Why, we will go out of the hotel and get you something to eat where they know how to behave decently." And Mrs. Lincoln already was tying the strings of her bonnet before the glass. Her impulsiveness alarmed me. "Surely, Mrs. Lincoln, you do not intend to go out on the street to night?" "Yes, I do. Do you suppose I am going to have you starve, when we can find something to eat on every corner?" "But you forget. You are here as Mrs. Clark, and not as Mrs. Lincoln. You came alone, and the people already suspect that everything is not right. If you go outside of the hotel to night, they will accept the fact as evidence against you." "Nonsense! What do you suppose I care for what these low-bred people think? Put on your things." "No, Mrs. Lincoln, I shall not go outside of the hotel to night, for I realize your situation, if you do not. Mrs. Lincoln has no reason to care what these people may say about her as Mrs. Lincoln, but she should be prudent, and give them no opportunity to say anything about her as Mrs. Clark." It was with difficulty I could convince her that she should act with caution. She was so frank and impulsive that she never once thought that her actions might be misconstrued. It did not occur to her that she might order dinner to be served in my room, so I went to bed without a mouthful to eat. The next morning Mrs. Lincoln knocked at my door before 6 o'clock. "Come, Elizabeth, get up. I know you must be hungry. Dress yourself quickly, and we will go out and get some breakfast. I was unable to sleep last night for thinking of you being forced to go to bed without anything to eat." I dressed myself as quickly as I could, and together we went out and took breakfast, at a restaurant on Broadway, some place between 609 and the St. Denis Hotel. I do not give the number, as I prefer leaving it to conjecture. Of one thing I am certain, the proprietor of the little restaurant little dreamed who one of his guests was that morning. After breakfast we walked up Broadway, and entering Union Square Park, took a seat on one of the benches under the trees, watched the children at play, and talked over the situation. Mrs. Lincoln told me, "Lizzie, yesterday morning I called for the Herald at the breakfast table, and on looking over the list of diamond brokers advertised, I selected the firm of W.H. Brady & Co., 609 Broadway. After breakfast I walked down to the house, and tried to sell them a lot of jewelry. I gave my name as Mrs. Clark. I first saw Mr. Judd, a member of the firm, a very pleasant gentleman. We were unable to agree about the price. He went back into the office, where a stout gentleman was seated at the desk, but I could not hear what he said. I know now what was said, and so shall the reader, in parenthesis. Mr. Brady has since told me that he remarked to Mr. Judd that the woman must be crazy to ask such outrageous prices, and to get rid of her as soon as possible. Soon after Mr. Judd came back to the counter, another gentleman, Mr. Keyes, as I have since learned, a silent partner in the house, entered the store. He came to the counter, and in looking over my jewelry discovered my name inside one of the rings. I had forgotten the ring, and when I saw him looking at the name so earnestly, I snatched the bauble from him, and put it into my pocket. I hastily gathered up my jewelry and started out. They asked for my address, and I left my card, Mrs. Clark, at the St. Denis Hotel. They are to call to see me this forenoon, when I shall enter into negotiations with them. Scarcely had we returned to the hotel when Mr. Keyes called, and Mrs. Clark disclosed to him that she was Mrs. Lincoln. He was much elated to find his surmise correct. Mrs. L. exhibited to him a large number of shawls, dresses, and fine laces, and told him that she was compelled to sell them in order to live. He was an earnest Republican, was much affected by her story, and denounced the ingratitude of the government in the severest terms. She complained to him of the treatment she had received at the St. Denis, and he advised her to move to another hotel forthwith. She readily consented, and as she wanted to be in an out-of-the-way place where she would not be recognized by any of her old friends, he recommended the Earle Hotel in Canal street. On the way down to the hotel that morning she acceded to a suggestion made by me, and supported by Mr. Keyes, that she confide in the landlord, and give him her name without registering, so as to insure the proper respect. Unfortunately, the Earle Hotel was full, and we had to select another place. We drove to the Union Place Hotel, where we secured rooms for Mrs. Clarke, Mrs. Lincoln changing her mind, deeming it would not be prudent to disclose her real name to any one. After we had become settled in our new quarters, Messrs. Keyes and Brady called frequently on Mrs. Lincoln, and held long conferences with her. They advised her to pursue the course she did, and were sanguine of success. Mrs. Lincoln was very anxious to dispose of her things, and return to Chicago as quickly and quietly as possible; but they presented the case in a different light, and, I regret to say, she was guided by their counsel. "Pooh!" said Mr. Brady. "Place your affairs in our hands, and we will raise you at least $100,000 in a few weeks. The people will not permit the widow of Abraham Lincoln to suffer; they will come to her rescue when they know she is in want." The argument seemed plausible, and Mrs. Lincoln quietly acceded to the proposals of Keyes and Brady. We remained quietly at the Union Place Hotel for a few days. On Sunday, Mrs. Lincoln accepted the use of a private carriage, and, accompanied by me, she drove out to Central Park. We did not enjoy the ride much, as the carriage was a close one, and we could not throw open the window for fear of being recognized by some one of the many thousands in the park. Mrs. Lincoln wore a heavy veil, so as to more effectually conceal her face. We came near being run into, and we had a spasm of alarm, for an accident would have exposed us to public gaze, and of course the masquerade would have been at an end. On Tuesday, I hunted up a number of dealers in second-hand clothing, and had them call at the hotel by appointment. Mrs. Lincoln soon discovered that they were hard people to drive a bargain with, so on Thursday we got into a close carriage, taking a bundle of dresses and shawls with us, and drove to a number of stores on 7th Avenue, where an attempt was made to dispose of a portion of the wardrobe. The dealers wanted the goods for little or nothing, and we found it a hard matter to drive a bargain with them. Mrs. Lincoln met the dealers squarely, but all of her tact and shrewdness failed to accomplish much. I do not care to dwell upon this portion of my story. Let it answer to say, that we returned to the hotel more disgusted than ever with the business in which we were engaged. There was much curiosity at the hotel in relation to us, as our movements were watched, and we were regarded with suspicion. Our trunks in the main hall below were examined daily, and curiosity was more keenly excited when the argus-eyed reporters for the press traced Mrs. Lincoln's name on the cover of one of her trunks. The letters had been rubbed out, but the faint outlines remained, and these outlines only served to stimulate curiosity. Messrs. Keyes and Brady called often, and they made Mrs. Lincoln believe that, if she would write certain letters for them to show to prominent politicians, they could raise a large sum of money for her. They argued that the Republican party would never permit it to be said that the wife of Abraham Lincoln was in want; that the leaders of the party would make heavy advances, rather than have it published to the world that Mrs. Lincoln's poverty compelled her to sell her wardrobe. Mrs. L.'s wants were urgent, as she had to borrow $600 from Keyes and Brady, and she was willing to adopt any scheme which promised to place a good bank account to her credit. At different times in her room at the Union Place Hotel she wrote the following letters: Chicago, September 18th, 1867. Mr. Brady, Commissioner Broker, No. 609 Broadway, New York. I have this day sent to you personal property, which I am compelled to part with, and which you will find of considerable value. The articles consist of 4 camel's hair shawls, 1 lace dress and shawl, a parasol cover, a diamond ring, 2 dress patterns, some furs, etc. Please have them appraised, and confer by letter with me. Very respectfully, Mrs. Lincoln. Chicago. Mr. Brady, No. 609 Broadway, New York City. Dear Sir, the articles I am sending you to dispose of were gifts of dear friends, which only urgent necessity compels me to part with, and I am especially anxious that they shall not be sacrificed. The circumstances are peculiar, and painfully embarrassing. Therefore I hope you will endeavor to realize as much as possible for them. Hoping to hear from you, I remain, very respectfully, Mrs. A. Lincoln. September 25th, 1867. W.H. Brady, Esquire. My great sorrow and loss have made me painfully sensitive. But as my feelings and pecuniary comforts were never regarded or even recognized in the midst of my overwhelming bereavement, now that I am pressed in a most startling manner for means of subsistence, I do not know why I should shrink from an opportunity of improving my trying position. Being assured that all you do will be appropriately executed, and in a manner that will not startle me very greatly, and excite as little comment as possible, again I shall leave all in your hands. I am passing through a very painful ordeal, which the country, in remembrance of my noble and devoted husband, should have spared me. I remain, with great respect, very truly, Mrs. Lincoln. P.S. As you mentioned that my goods have been valued at over $24,000, I will be willing to make a reduction of $8,000, and relinquish them for $16,000. If this is not accomplished, I will continue to sell and advertise largely until every article is sold. I must have means to live, at least in a medium comfortable state. M.L. The letters are dated Chicago, and addressed to Mr. Brady, though every one of them was written in New York, for when Mrs. L. left the West for the East, she had settled upon no definite plan of action. Mr. Brady proposed to show the letters to certain politicians, and ask for money on a threat to publish them if his demands, as Mrs. Lincoln's agent, were not complied with. When writing the letters, I stood at Mrs. Lincoln's elbow, and suggested that they be couched in the mildest language possible. "Never mind, Lizzie," she said, "anything to raise the wind. One might as well be killed for a sheep as a lamb." This latter expression was a favorite one of hers, she meaning by it that if one must be punished for an act, such as theft for instance, that the punishment would be no more severe if a sheep were taken instead of a lamb. Mr. Brady exhibited the letters quite freely, but the parties to whom they were shown refused to make any advances. Meanwhile our stay at the Union Place Hotel excited so much curiosity that a sudden movement was rendered expedient to avoid discovery. We sent the large trunks to 609 Broadway, packed the smaller ones, paid our bills at the hotel, and one morning hastily departed for the country, where we remained 3 days. The movement was successful. The keen-eyed reporters for the daily papers were thrown off the scent, and when we returned to the city we took rooms at the Brandreth House, where Mrs. Lincoln registered as Mrs. Morris. I had desired her to go to the Metropolitan Hotel and confide in the proprietors, as the Messrs. Leland had always been very kind to her, treating her with distinguished courtesy whenever she was their guest, but this she refused to do. Several days passed, and Messrs. Brady and Keyes were forced to acknowledge that their scheme was a failure. The letters had been shown to various parties, but every one declined to act. Aside from a few dresses sold at small prices to second-hand dealers, Mrs. Lincoln's wardrobe was still in her possession. Her visit to New York had proved disastrous, and she was goaded into more desperate measures. Money she must have, and to obtain it she proposed to play a bolder game. She gave Mr. Brady permission to place her wardrobe on exhibition for sale, and authorized him to publish the letters in the World. After coming to this determination, she packed her trunks to return to Chicago. I accompanied her to the depot, and told her good bye, on the very morning that the letters appeared in the World. Mrs. Lincoln wrote me the incidents of the journey, and the letter describes the story more graphically than I could hope to do. I suppress many passages, as they are of too confidential a nature to be given to the public. Chicago, October 6th. My dear Lizzie, my ink is like myself and my spirits failing, so I write you to-day with a pencil. I had a solitary ride to this place, as you may imagine, varied by one or two amusing incidents. I found after you left me I could not continue in the car in which you left me, owing to every seat's berth being engaged. So, being simple Mrs. Clark, I had to eat humble pie in a car less commodious. My thoughts were too much with my dry goods and interests at 609 Broadway to care much for my surroundings, as uncomfortable as they were. In front of me sat a middle-aged, gray-haired, respectable-looking gentleman, who for the whole morning had the page of the World before him which contained my letters and business concerns. About 4 hours before arriving at Chicago, a consequential-looking man, of formidable size, seated himself by him, and it appears they were entirely unknown to each other. The well-fed looking individual opened the conversation with the man who had read the World so attentively, and the conversation soon grew warm and earnest. The war and its devastation engaged them. The bluffy individual, doubtless a Republican who had pocketed his many thousands, spoke of the widows of the land, made so by the war. My reading man remarked to him: "Are you aware that Mrs. Lincoln is in indignant circumstances and has to sell her clothing and jewelry to gain means to make life more endurable?" The well-conditioned man replied: "I do not blame her for selling her clothing if she wishes it. I suppose when sold, she will convert the proceeds into 5/20s to enable her to have means to be buried." The World man turned towards him with a searching glance, and replied, with the haughtiest manner, "That woman is not dead yet." The discomfited individual looked down, never spoke another word, and in half an hour left his seat and did not return. I give you word for word as the conversation occurred. May it be found through the execution of my friends, Messrs. Brady and Keyes, that that woman is not yet dead, and being alive, she speaketh and gaineth valuable hearers. Such is life. Those who have been injured, how gladly the injurer would consign them to Mother Earth and forgetfulness. Hoping I should not be recognized at Fort Wayne, I thought I would get out at dinner for a cup of tea. Will show you what a creature of fate I am, as miserable as it sometimes is. I went into the dining room alone, and was ushered up to the table, where, at its head, sat a very elegant-looking gentleman, at his side a middle-aged lady. My black veil was doubled over my face. I had taken my seat next to him, he at the head of the table, I at his left hand. I immediately felt a pair of eyes was gazing at me. I looked him full in the face, and the glance was earnestly returned. I sipped my water, and said, "Mr. S., is this indeed you?" His face was as pale as the tablecloth. We entered into conversation, when I asked him how long since he had left Chicago. He replied, 2 weeks since. He said, "How strange you should be on the train and I not know it." As soon as I could escape from the table I did so by saying, "I must secure a cup of tea for a lady friend with me who has a headache." I had scarcely returned to the car, when he entered it with a cup of tea borne by his own aristocratic hands. I was a good deal annoyed by seeing him, and he was so agitated that he spilled half of the cup over my elegantly gloved hands. He looked very sad, and I fancied 609 Broadway occupied his thoughts. I apologized for the absent lady who wished the cup, by saying that in my absence she had slipped out for it. His heart was in his eyes, notwithstanding my veiled face. Pity for me, I fear, has something to do with all this. I never saw his manner so gentle and sad. This was nearly evening, and I did not see him again, as he returned to the lady, who was his sister-in-law from the East. What evil spirit possessed me to go out and get that cup of tea? When he left me, woman-like I tossed the cup of tea out of the window, and tucked my head down and shed bitter tears. At the depot my darling little Taddie was waiting for me, and his voice never sounded so sweet. My dear Lizzie, do visit Mr. Brady each morning at 9 o'clock, and urge them all you can. I see by the papers Stewart has returned. To-morrow I will send up the invoice of goods, which please to not give up. How much I miss you, tongue cannot tell. Forget my fright and nervousness of the evening before. Of course you were as innocent as a child in all you did. I consider you my best living friend, and I am struggling to be enabled some day to repay you. Write me often, as you promised. Always truly yours, M. L. End of chapter 15, part 1. Chapter 15, Part 2 of Behind the Scenes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bridget Gage. Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. Chapter 15, Part 2. Secret History of Mrs. Lincoln's Wardrobe in New York. It is not necessary for me to dwell upon the public history of Mrs. Lincoln's unfortunate venture. The question has been discussed in all the newspapers of the land, and these discussions are so recent that it would be useless to introduce them in these pages, even if I had an inclination to do so. The following, from the New York Evening Express, briefly tells the story. The attraction for ladies, and the curious and speculative of the other sex in this city, just now, is the grand exposition of Lincoln dresses at the office of Mr. Brady, on Broadway, a few doors south of Houston Street. The publicity given to the articles on exhibition and for sale has excited the public curiosity, and hundreds of people, principally women with considerable leisure moments at disposal, daily throng the rooms of Mr. Brady, and give himself and his shopwoman more to do than either bargained for, when a lady, with face concealed with a veil, called and arranged for the sale of the superabundant clothing of a distinguished and titled but nameless lady. 25 dresses, folded or tossed about by frequent examinations, lie exposed upon a closed piano and upon a lounge. Shawls, rich and rare, are displayed upon the backs of chairs. But the more exacting obtain a better view and closer inspection by the lady attendant throwing them occasionally upon her shoulders, just to oblige, so that their appearance on promenade might be seen and admired. Furs, laces, and jewelry are in a glass case, but the $4,000 in gold point outfit is kept in a pasteboard box, and only shown on special request. The feeling of the majority of visitors is adverse to the course Mrs. Lincoln has thought proper to pursue, and the criticisms are as severe as the cavillings are persistent at the quality of some of the dresses. These latter are labeled at Mrs. Lincoln's own estimate, and prices range from $25 to $75, about 50% less than cost. Some of them, if not worn long, have been worn much. They are jagged under the arms and at the bottom of the skirt. Stains are on the lining, and other objections present themselves to those who oscillate between the dresses and dollars, notwithstanding they have been worn by Madam Lincoln, as a lady who looked from behind a pair of gold spectacles remarked. Other dresses, however, have scarcely been worn, one perhaps while Mrs. Lincoln sat for her picture, and from one the basting threads had not yet been removed. The general testimony is that the wearing apparel is high priced, and some of the examiners say that the cost figures must have been put on by the dressmakers, or, if such was not the case, that gold was $250 when they were purchased, and is now but $140, so that a dress for which $150 was paid at the rate of high figures cannot be called cheap at half that sum after it has been worn considerable, and perhaps passed out of fashion. The peculiarity of the dresses is that most of them are cut low-necked, a taste which some ladies attribute to Mrs. Lincoln's appreciation of her own bust. On Saturday last an offer was made for all the dresses. The figure named was less than the aggregate estimate placed on them. Mr. Brady, however, having no discretionary power, he declined to close the bargain, but notified Mrs. Lincoln by mail. Of course, as yet, no reply has been received. Mrs. L. desires that the auction should be deferred till the 31st of the present month, and efforts made to dispose of the articles at private sale up to that time. A Mrs. C. called on Mr. Brady this morning, and examined minutely each shawl. Before leaving, the lady said that, at the time when there was a hesitancy about the President issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, she sent to Mrs. Lincoln an ashes of rose shawl, which was manufactured in China, forwarded to France, and thence to Mrs. C. in New York. The shawl, the lady remarked, was a very handsome one, and should it come into the hands of Mr. Brady to be sold, would like to be made aware of the fact, so as to obtain possession again. Mr. Brady promised to acquaint the ashes of rose donor, if the prized article should be among the 2 trunks of goods now on the way from Chicago. So many erroneous reports were circulated that I made a correct statement to one of the editors of the New York Evening News. The article based upon the memoranda furnished by me appeared in the News of October 12th, 1867. I reproduce a portion of it in this connection. Mrs. Lincoln feels sorely aggrieved at many of the harsh criticisms that have been passed upon her for traveling incognito. She claims that she adopted this course from motives of delicacy, desiring to avoid publicity. While here, she spoke to but two former acquaintances, and these two gentlemen whom she met on Broadway. Hundreds passed her who had courted her good graces when she reigned supreme at the White House, but there was no recognition. It was not because she had changed much in personal appearance, but was merely owing to the heavy crape veil that hid her features from view. She seeks to defend her course while in this city, and with much force too, adverting to the fact that the Empress of France frequently disposes of her cast-off wardrobe, and publicly too, without being subjected to any unkind remarks regarding its propriety. She claims the same immunity here as is accorded in Paris to Eugenie. As regards her obscurity while in the city, she says that foreigners of note and position frequently come to our stores, and under assumed names travel from point to point throughout our vast domain, to avoid recognition and the inconveniences resulting from being known, though it even be in the form of honors. For herself she regards quiet preferable to ostentatious show, which would have cost her much indirectly, if not directly, and this she felt herself unable to bear, according to the measure of her present state of finances. In a recent letter to her bosom friend, Mrs. Elizabeth Keckley, Mrs. Lincoln pathetically remarks, "Elizabeth, if evil come from this, pray for my deliverance, as I did it for the best." This referred to her action in placing her personal effects before the public for sale, and to the harsh remarks that have been made thereon, by some whom she had formerly regarded as her friends. As to the articles which belonged to Mr. Lincoln, they can all be accounted for in a manner satisfactory even to an over-critical public. During the time Mr. Lincoln was in office he was the recipient of several canes. After his death one was given to the Hon. Charles Sumner, another to Fred Douglass, another to the Rev. H. Garnett of this city, and another to Mr. William Slade, the present steward of the White House, who in Mr. Lincoln's lifetime was his messenger. This gentleman also received some of Mr. Lincoln's apparel, among which was his heavy gray shawl. Several other of the messengers employed about the White House came in for a share of the deceased President's effects. The shepherd plaid shawl which Mr. Lincoln wore during the milder weather, and which was rendered somewhat memorable as forming part of his famous disguise, together with the Scotch cap, when he wended his way secretly to the Capitol to be inaugurated as President, was given to Dr. Abbott of Canada, who had been one of his warmest friends. During the war this gentleman, as a surgeon in the United States Army, was in Washington in charge of a hospital, and thus became acquainted with the head of the nation. His watch, his penknife, his gold pencil, and his glasses, are now in possession of his son Robert. Nearly all else than these few things have passed out of the family, as Mrs. Lincoln did not wish to retain them. But all were freely given away, and not an article was parted with for money. The Rev. Dr. Gurley of Washington was a spiritual adviser of the President and his family. They attended his church. When little Willie died, he officiated at the funeral. He was a most intimate friend of the family, and when Mr. Lincoln lay upon his deathbed, Mr. Gurley was by his side. He, as his clergyman, performed the funeral rites upon the body of the deceased President, when it lay cold in death at the city of Washington. He received the hat worn last by Mr. Lincoln, as we have before stated, and it is still retained by him. The dress that was worn by Mrs. Lincoln on the night of the assassination was presented to Mrs. William Slade. It is a black silk with a little white stripe. Most of the other articles that adorned Mrs. Lincoln on that fatal night became the property of Mrs. Keckley. She has the most of them carefully stowed away, and intends keeping them during her life as mementos of a mournful event. The principal articles among these are the earrings, the bonnet, and the velvet cloak. The writer of this saw the latter on Thursday. It bears most palpable marks of the assassination, being completely bespattered with blood that has dried upon its surface, and which can never be removed. A few words as regard the disposition and habits of Mrs. Lincoln. She is no longer the sprightly body she was when her very presence illumed the White House with gaiety. Now she is sad and sedate, seeking seclusion, and maintaining communication merely with her most intimate personal friends. The most of her time she devotes to instructive reading within the walls of her boudoir. Laying her book aside spasmodically, she places her hand upon her forehead, as if ruminating upon something momentous. Then her hand wanders amid her heavy tresses, while she ponders for but a few seconds. Then, by a sudden start, she approaches her writing stand, seizes a pen, and indites a few hasty lines to some trusty friend, upon the troubles that weigh so heavily upon her. Speedily it is sent to the post office. But hardly has the mail departed from the city before she regrets her hasty letter, and would give much to recall it. But too late, it is gone, and probably the secrets it contains are not confidentially kept by the party to whom it was addressed, and soon it furnishes inexhaustible material for gossip-loving people. As some citizens have expressed themselves desirous of aiding Mrs. Lincoln, a subscription book was opened at the office of her agent, Mr. Brady, No. 609 Broadway, this morning. There is no limitation as to the amount which may be given, though there was a proposition that $1 should be contributed by each person who came forward to inspect the goods. Had each person who handled these articles given this sum, a handsome amount would already have been realized. The colored people are moving in this matter. They intend to take up collections in their churches for the benefit of Mrs. Lincoln. They are enthusiastic, and a trifle from every African in the city would, in the aggregate, swell into an immense sum, which would be doubly acceptable to Mrs. Lincoln. It would satisfy her that the black people still have the memory of her deceased husband fresh in their minds. The goods still remain exposed to sale, but it is now announced that they will be sold at a public auction on the 30th of this month, unless they be disposed of before that at private sale. It is stated in the article that the colored people are moving in this matter. The colored people were surprised to hear of Mrs. Lincoln's poverty, and the news of her distress called forth strong sympathy from their warm, generous hearts. Rev. H. H. Garnet, of New York City, and Mr. Frederick Douglass, of Rochester, New York, proposed to lecture in behalf of the widow of the lamented President, and schemes were on foot to raise a large sum of money by contribution. The colored people recognized Abraham Lincoln as their great friend, and they were anxious to show their kind interest in the welfare of his family in some way more earnest and substantial than simple words. I wrote Mrs. Lincoln what we proposed to do, and she promptly replied, declining to receive aid from the colored people. I showed her letter to Mr. Garnet and Mr. Douglass, and the whole project was at once abandoned. She afterwards consented to receive contributions from my people, but as the services of Messrs. Douglass, Garnet, and others had been refused when first offered, they declined to take an active part in the scheme, so nothing was ever done. The following letters were written before Mrs. Lincoln declined to receive aid from the colored people: 183 Bleecker Street, New York, October 16th, 1867. J. H. Brady, Esquire. I have just received your favor, together with the circulars. I will do all that lies in my power, but I fear that will not be as much as you anticipate. I think, however, that a contribution from the colored people of New York will be worth something in a moral point of view, and likely that will be the most that will be accomplished in the undertaking. I am thoroughly with you in the work, although but little may be done. I am truly yours, Henry Highland Garnet. P.S. I think it would be well if you would drop a line to Mr. Frederick Douglass, at Rochester, New York. H. H. G. Rochester, October 18th, 1867. My dear Mrs. Keckley, you judge me rightly. I am willing to do what I can to place the widow of our martyr President in the affluent position which her relation to that good man and to the country entitles her to. But I doubt the wisdom of getting up a series of lectures for that purpose. That is just the last thing that should be done. Still, if the thing is done, it should be done on a grand scale. The best speakers in the country should be secured for the purpose. You should not place me at the head nor at the foot of the list, but sandwich me between, for thus out of the way, it would not give color to the idea. I am to speak in Newark on Wednesday evening next, and will endeavor to see you on the subject. Of course, if it would not be too much to ask, I would gladly see Mrs. Lincoln, if this could be done in a quiet way without the reporters getting hold of it, and using it in some way to the prejudice of that already much abused lady. As I shall see you soon, there is less reason to write you at length. I am, dear Madam, with highest respect, very truly yours, Frederick Douglass. Pottsville, October 29th, 1867. My dear Mrs. Keckley, you know the drift of my views concerning the subscription for Mrs. Lincoln, yet I wish to place them more distinctly before you, so that, if you have occasion to refer to me in connection with the matter, you can do so with accuracy and certainty. It is due Mrs. Lincoln that she should be indemnified, as far as money can do so, for the loss of her beloved husband. Honor, gratitude, and a manly sympathy, all say yes to this. I am willing to go farther than this, and say that Mrs. Lincoln herself should be the judge of the amount which shall be deemed sufficient, believing that she would not transcend reasonable limits. The obligation resting on the nation at large is great and increasing, but especially does it become colored men to recognize that obligation. It was the hand of Abraham Lincoln that broke the fetters of our enslaved people and let them out of the house of bondage. When he was slain, our great benefactor fell, and left his wife and children to the care of those for whom he gave up all. Shame on the man or woman who, under such circumstances, would grudge a few paltry dollars to smooth the pathway of such a widow. All this and more I feel and believe, but such is the condition of this question, owing to party feeling and personal animosities now mixed up with it, that we are compelled to consider these in the effort we are making to obtain subscriptions. Now, about the meeting in Cooper Institute, I hold that that meeting should only be held in concert with other movements. It is bad generalship to put into the field only a fraction of your army, when you have no means to prevent their being cut to pieces. It is gallant to go forth single-handed, but is it wise? I want to see something more than the spiteful herald behind me when I step forward in this cause at the Cooper Institute. Let Mr. Brady out with his circulars, with his list of commanding names. Let the Herald and Tribune give a united blast upon their bugles. Let the city be placarded, and the doors of Cooper Institute be flung wide open, and the people, without regard to party, come up to the discharge of this national duty. Don't let the cause be made ridiculous by failure at the outset. Mr. Garnet and I could bear any mortification of this kind, but the cause could not. And our cause must not be damaged by any such generalship, which would place us in the van unsupported. I shall be at home by Saturday. Please write me, and let me know how matters are proceeding. Show this letter to Messrs. Brady and Garnet. I am, dear Madam, very truly yours, Frederick Douglass. Rochester, October 30th, 1867. My dear Mrs. Keckley, it is just possible that I may not take New York in my route homeward. In that case please write me directly at Rochester, and let me know how fully the subscription business is proceeding. The meeting here last night was a grand success. I speak again this evening, and perhaps at Reading to-morrow evening. My kind regards and all who think of me at 21, including Mrs. Lawrence. Very truly yours, Frederick Douglass. Rochester, November 10th, 1867. My dear Mrs. Keckley, I very easily read your handwriting. With practice you will not only write legibly but elegantly, so no more apologies for bad writing. Penmanship has always been one of my own deficiencies, and I know how to sympathize with you. I am just home, and find your letter awaiting me. You should have received an earlier answer but for this absence. I am sorry it will be impossible for me to see you before I go to Washington. I am leaving home this week for Ohio, and shall go from Ohio to Washington. I shall be in New York a day or two after my visit to Washington, and will see you there. Any public demonstration in which it will be desirable for me to take part ought to come off the last of this month or the first of next. I thank you sincerely for the note containing a published letter of dear Mrs. Lincoln. Both letters do credit to the excellent lady. I prize her beautiful letter to me very highly. It is the letter of a refined and spirited lady, let the world say what it will of her. I would write her a word of acknowledgment, but for fear to burden her with correspondence. I am glad that Mr. Garnet and yourself saw Mr. Greeley, and that he takes the right view of the matter. But we want more than right views, and delay is death to the movement. What you now want is action and co operation. If Mr. Brady does not for any reason find himself able to move the machinery, somebody else should be found to take his place. He made a good impression on me when I saw him, but I have not seen the promised simultaneous movement of which we spoke when together. This whole thing should be in the hands of some recognized solid man in New York. No man would be better than Mr. Greeley. No man in the state is more laughed at, and yet no man is more respected and trusted. A dollar placed in his hands would be as safe for the purpose as in a burglar-proof safe, and what is better still, everybody believes this. This testimonial must be more than a negro testimonial. It is a great national duty. Mr. Lincoln did everything for the black man, but he did it not for the black man's sake, but for the nation's sake. His life was given for the nation. But for being president, Mr. Lincoln would have been alive, and Mrs. Lincoln would have been a wife, and not a widow, as now. Do all you can, dear Mrs. Keckley. Nobody can do more than you in removing the mountains of prejudice towards that good lady, and opening the way of success in the plan. I am, dear madam, very truly yours, Frederick Douglass. Many persons called at 609 Broadway to examine Mrs. Lincoln's wardrobe, but as curiosity prompted each visit, but few articles were sold. Messrs. Brady and Keyes were not very energetic, and, as will be seen by the letters of Mrs. Lincoln, published in the appendix, that lady ultimately lost all confidence in them. It was proposed to send circulars, stating Mrs. Lincoln's wants, and appealing to the generosity of the people for aid, broadcast over the country, but the scheme failed. Messrs. Brady and Keyes were unable to obtain the names of prominent men, whom the people had confidence in, for the circular, to give character and responsibility to the movement, so the whole thing was abandoned. With the Reverend Mr. Garnet, I called on Mr. Greeley at the office of the Tribune in connection with this scheme. Mr. Greeley received us kindly, and listened patiently to our proposals, then said, "I shall take pleasure in rendering you what assistance I can, but the movement must be engineered by responsible parties. Messrs. Brady and Keyes are not the men to be at the head of it. Nobody knows who they are or what they are. Place the matter in the hands of those that the people know and have some confidence in, and then there will be a chance for success." We thanked Mr. Greeley for his advice, for we believed it to be good advice, and bowed ourselves out of his room. When Messrs. Brady and Keyes were informed of the result of our interview, they became very much excited, and denounced Mr. Greeley as an old fool. This put an end to the circular movement. The enterprise was nipped in the bud, and with the bud withered Mrs. Lincoln's last hope for success. A portion of the wardrobe was then taken to Providence, to be exhibited, but without her consent. Mr. Brady remarked that the exhibition would bring in money, and as money must be raised, this was the last resort. He was of the impression that Mrs. Lincoln would approve of any movement, so it ended in success. This, at least, is a charitable view to take of the subject. Had the exhibition succeeded in Providence, it is my opinion that the agents of Brady and Keyes would now be traveling over the country, exposing Mrs. Lincoln's wardrobe to the view of the curious, at so much per head. As is well known, the city authorities refused to allow the exhibition to take place in Providence. Therefore Mr. Brady returned to New York with the goods, and the traveling show scheme, like the circular scheme, was abandoned. Weeks lengthened into months, and at Mrs. Lincoln's urgent request I remained in New York, to look after her interests. When she left the city I engaged quiet lodgings in a private family, where I remained about 2 months, when I moved to 14 Carroll Place, and became one of the regular boarders of the house. Mrs. Lincoln's venture proved so disastrous that she was unable to reward me for my services, and I was compelled to take in sewing to pay for my daily bread. My New York expedition has made me richer in experience, but poorer in purse. During the entire winter I have worked early and late, and practiced the closest of economy. Mrs. Lincoln's business demanded much of my time, and it was a constant source of trouble to me. When Mrs. L. left for the West, I expected to be able to return to Washington in 1 week from the day. But unforeseen difficulties arose, and I have been detained in the city for several months. As I am writing the concluding pages of this book, I have succeeded in closing up Mrs. Lincoln's imprudent business arrangement at 609 Broadway. The firm of Brady and Keyes is dissolved, and Mr. Keyes has adjusted the account. The story is told in a few words. On the 4th of March, I received the following invoice from Mr. Keyes: March 4th, '68. Invoice of articles sent to Mrs. A. Lincoln: 1 trunk, 1 lace dress, 1 lace dress flounced, 5 lace shawls, 3 camel hair shawls, 1 lace parasol cover, 1 lace handkerchief, 1 sable boa, 1 white boa, 1 set furs, 2 Paisley shawls, 2 gold bracelets, 16 dresses, 2 opera cloaks, 1 purple shawl, 1 feather cape, 28 yards silk. Articles sold: 1 diamond ring, 3 small rings, 1 set furs, 1 camel hair shawl, 1 red shawl, 2 dresses, 1 child's shawl, 1 lace Chantilly shawl. The charges of the firm amounted to $800. Mrs. Lincoln sent me a check for this amount. I handed this check to Mr. Keyes, and he gave me the following receipt: Received, New York, March 4th, 1868, of Mrs. Abraham Lincoln, $820 by draft on American National Bank, New York. S. C. Keyes. I packed the articles invoiced, and expressed the trunks to Mrs. Lincoln at Chicago. I then demanded and received a receipt worded as follows: Received, New York, March 4th, 1868, of Mrs. Abraham Lincoln, $820 in full of all demands of every kind, up to date. S. C. Keyes. This closed up the business, and with it I close the imperfect story of my somewhat romantic life. I have experienced many ups and downs, but still am stout of heart. The labor of a lifetime has brought me nothing in a pecuniary way. I have worked hard, but fortune, fickle dame, has not smiled upon me. If poverty did not weigh me down as it does, I would not now be toiling by day with my needle and writing by night, in the plain little room on the 4th floor of No. 14 Carroll Place. And yet I have learned to love the garret-like room. Here, with Mrs. Amelia Lancaster as my only companion, I have spent many pleasant hours, as well as sad ones, and every chair looks like an old friend. In memory I have traveled through the shadows and the sunshine of the past, and the bare walls are associated with the visions that have come to me from the long ago. As I love the children of memory, so I love every article in this room, for each has become a part of memory itself. Though poor in worldly goods, I am rich in friendships, and friends are a recompense for all the woes of the darkest pages of life. For sweet friendship's sake, I can bear more burdens than I have borne. The letters appended from Mrs. Lincoln to myself throw a flood of light upon the history of the old clothes speculation in New York. Chapter 15.
Appendix of Behind the Scenes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Day. Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. Appendix. Letters from Mrs. Lincoln to Mrs. Keckley. Chicago, Sunday morning, October 6. My dear Lizzie, I am writing this morning with a broken heart after a sleepless night of great mental suffering. R. came up last evening like a maniac and almost threatening his life, looking like death, because the letters of the world were published in yesterday's paper. I could not refrain from weeping when I saw him so miserable. But yet, my dear good Lizzie, was it not to protect myself and help others, and was not my motive an action of the purest kind? Pray for me that this cup of affliction may pass from me, or be sanctified to me. I weep whilst I am writing. I pray for death this morning. Only my darling Tatty prevents my taking my life. I shall have to endure a round of newspaper abuse from the Republicans because I dared venture to relieve a few of my wants. Tell Mr. Brady and Keyes not to have a line of mine once more in print. I am nearly losing my reason. Your friend, M. L. Chicago, October 8. My dear Lizzie, bowed down with suffering and anguish, again I write you. As we might have expected, the Republicans are falsifying me, and doing just as they did when they prevented the Congressional appropriation. Mrs. knows something about these same people. As her husband is living, they dare not utter all they would desire to speak. You know yourself how innocently I have acted, and from the best and purest motives. They will howl on to prevent my disposing of my things. What a vile, vile set they are! The Tribune, here, Mr. White's paper, wrote a very beautiful editorial yesterday in my behalf. Yet knowing that I have been deprived of my rights by the party, I suppose I would be mobbed if I ventured out. What a world of anguish this is, and how I have been made to suffer! You would not recognize me now. The glass shows me a pale, wretched, haggard face, and my dresses are like bags on me. And all because I was doing what I felt to be my duty. Our minister, Mr. Swayze, called on me yesterday, and said I had done perfectly right. Mrs. F. says everyone speaks in the same way. The politicians, knowing they have deprived me of my just rights, would prefer to see me starve rather than dispose of my things. They will prevent the sale of anything, so I have telegraphed for them. I hope you have received from B. the letters I have consigned to his care. See to this. Show none of them. Write me every day. M. L. Chicago, Wednesday, October 9th. My dear Lizzie, it appears as if the fiends had let loose, for the Republican papers are tearing me to pieces in this border ruffian West. If I had committed murder in every city in this blessed Union, I could not be more traduced. And you know how innocent I have been of the intention of doing wrong. A piece in the Morning Tribune, signed B., pretending to be a lady, says there is no doubt Mrs. L. is deranged, has been for years past, and will end her life in a lunatic asylum. They would doubtless like me to begin it now. Mr. S., a very kind, sympathizing minister, has been with me this morning, and has now gone to see Mr. Medill of the Tribune, to know if he sanctioned his paper publishing such an article. Pray for me, dear Lizzie, for I am very miserable and broken-hearted. Since writing this, I have just received a letter from Mr. Keyes, begging and pleading with me to allow them to use my name for donations. I think I will consent. Truly yours, M. L. Chicago, Sunday, October 13. My dear Lizzie, I am greatly disappointed, having only received one letter from you since we parted, which was dated the day after. Day after day I sent to Mrs. F. for letters. After your promise of writing to me every other day, I can scarcely understand it. I hope to-morrow will bring me a letter from you. How much I miss you cannot be expressed. I hope you have arrived safely in Washington, and will tell me everything. Was there ever such cruel newspaper abuse lavished upon an unoffending woman as has been showered upon my devoted head? The people of this ungrateful country are like the dogs in the manger, will neither do anything themselves, nor allow me to improve my own condition. What a government we have! All their abuse lavished upon me only lowers themselves in the estimation of all true-hearted people. The Springfield Journal had an editorial a few days since, with the important information that Mrs. Lincoln had been known to be deranged for years, and should be pitied for all her strange acts. I should have been all right if I had allowed them to take possession of the White House. In the comfortable stealings by contracts from the government, these low creatures are allowed to hurl their malicious wrath at me, with no one to defend me or protect me if I should starve. These people injure themselves far more than they could do me by their lies and villainy. Their aim is to prevent my goods being sold, or anything being done for me. In this, I very much fear, they have succeeded. Write me, my dear friend, your candid opinion about everything. I wish to be made better off, quite as much to improve your condition as well as for myself. 2 weeks ago, dear Lizzie, we were in that den of discomfort and dirt. Now we are far asunder. Every other day for the past week I have had a chill brought on by excitement and suffering of mind. In the midst of it I have moved into my winter quarters, and am now very comfortably situated. My parlor and bedroom are very sweetly furnished. I am lodged in a handsome house, a very kind, good, quiet family, and their meals are excellent. I consider myself fortunate in all this. I feel assured that the Republicans, who, to cover up their own perfidy and neglect, have used every villainous falsehood in their power to injure me. I fear they have more than succeeded, but if their day of reckoning does not come in this world, it will surely in the next. Saturday. I have determined to shed no more tears over all their cruel falsehoods, yet, just now, I feel almost forsaken by God and man, except by the latter to be vilified. Write me all that Keyes and Brady think of the result. For myself, after such abuse, I expect nothing. Oh, that I could see you! Write me, dear Lizzie, if only a line. I cannot understand your silence. Hereafter direct your letters to Mrs. A. Lincoln, 460 West Washington Street, Chicago, Illinois. Care of D. Cole. Remember 460. I am always so anxious to hear from you. I am feeling so friendless in the world. I remain always your affectionate friend, M. L. Postscript to letter of October 24. I cannot send this letter off without writing you 2 little incidents that have occurred within the past week. We may call it justice rendered for evil words, to say the least. There is a paper published in Chicago called the Republican, owned and published by Springfield men. Each morning since my return it has been thrown at my door, filled with abuse of myself. 4 days ago a piece appeared in it, asking what right had Mrs. L. to diamonds and laces. Yesterday morning an article appeared in the same paper, announcing that the day previous, at the house of Mr. Bunn, the owner of the paper, in Springfield, Illinois, the house had been entered at 11 in the morning by burglars, and had been robbed of 5 diamond rings and a quantity of fine laces. This morning's paper announces the recovery of these articles. Mr. Bunn, who made his hundreds of thousands off our government, is running this paper, and denouncing the wife of the man from whom he obtained his means. I enclose you the article about the recovery of the goods. A few years ago he had a small grocery in S. These facts can be authenticated. Another case in point. The evening I left my house to come here, the young daughter of one of my neighbors in the same block was in a house not a square off, and in a childish manner was regretting that I could not retain my house. The man in the house said, "Why waste your tears and regrets on Mrs. Lincoln?" An hour afterward the husband and wife went out to make a call, doubtless to gossip about me. On their return they found their young boy had almost blinded himself with gunpowder. Who will say that the cry of the widow and fatherless is disregarded in his sight? If man is not merciful, God will be in his own time. M. L. Chicago, October 29. My dear Lizzie, I received a very pleasant note from Mr. F. Douglass on yesterday. I will reply to it this morning, and enclose it to you to hand or send him immediately. In this morning's Tribune there was a little article evidently designed to make capital against me just now, that 3 of my brothers were in the Southern army during the war. If they had been friendly with me, they might have said they were half-brothers of Mrs. L., whom she had not known since they were infants, and as she left Kentucky at an early age, her sympathies were entirely Republican, that her feelings were entirely with the North during the war, and always. I never failed to urge my husband to be an extreme Republican, and now, in the day of my trouble, you see how this very party is trying to work against me. Tell Mr. Douglass and everyone how deeply my feelings were enlisted in the cause of freedom. Why harp upon these half-brothers, whom I never knew since they were infants, and scarcely then, for my early home was truly at a boarding school? Write to him all this, and talk it to everyone else. If we succeed, I will soon send you enough for a very large supply of trimming material for the winter. Truly, M. L. Chicago, November 2nd. My dear Lizzie, your letter of last Wednesday is received, and I cannot refrain from expressing my surprise that before now K. and B. did not go out in search of names, and have sent forth all those circulars. Their conduct is becoming mysterious. We have heard enough of their talk. It is time now they should be acting. Their delay, I fear, has ruined the business. The circulars should all have been out before the election. I cannot understand their slowness. As Mr. Greeley's home is in New York, he could certainly have been found had he been sought, and there are plenty of other good men in New York as well as himself. I venture to say that before the election not a circular will be sent out. I begin to think they are making a political business of my clothes, and not for my benefit either. Their delay in acting is becoming very suspicious. Their slow, bad management is ruining every prospect of success. I fear you are only losing your time in New York, and that I shall be left in debt for what I am owing the firm. I have written to K & B, and they do nothing that I request. I want neither Mr. Douglas nor Garnet to lecture in my behalf. The conduct in New York is disgusting me with the whole business. I cannot understand what they have been about. The delay has only given the enemies time to gather strength. What does it all mean? Of course, give the lady at 609 permission to sell the dresses cheaper. I am feeling wretchedly over the slowness and do-nothing style of B&K. I believe in my heart I am being used as a tool for party purposes, and they do not design sending out a circular. Your friend, M.L. Chicago, November 9, 1867. My dear Lizzie, did you receive a letter a few days since with one enclosed for F. Douglas, also a printed letter of mine which I wished him to read? Do write me every other day at least. I am so nervous and miserable. And Lizzie, dear, I fear we have not the least chance of success. Do remain in New York a little longer, and occupy yourself with the sewing of your friends. Then I shall be able to learn something about my business. In your heart you know there will be no success. Why do you not candidly express yourself to me? Write me, if only a few lines, and that very frequently. R. called up on yesterday with Judge Davis. R. goes with Judge D. on Tuesday to settle the estate, which will give us each about $25,000, with the income I told you of, $1,700 a year for each of us. You made a mistake about my house costing $2,700. It was $1,700. The $22,000 Congress gave me I spent for house and furniture, which, owing to the smallness of my income, I was obliged to leave. I mention about the division of the estate to you, dear Lizzie, because when it is done the papers will hop upon it. You can explain everything in New York. Please do so to every one. Please see H.G. if it should come out in the papers. I had hoped, if something was gained, to have immediately placed you in more pleasant circumstances. Do urge F.D. to add his name to the circular. Also get them to have Beecher's. There must not be an hour's delay in this. R. is very spiteful at present, and I think hurries up the division to cross my purposes. He mentioned yesterday that he was going to the Rocky Mountains so soon as Edgar Wells joined him. He is very deep. Write me, do, when you receive this. Your silence pains me. Truly yours, M.L. Chicago, November 9. My dear Lizzie, I closed and sent off my letter before I had finished all I had to say. Do not hint to K or B, or anyone else, my doubts of them. Only watch them. As to S., so many falsehoods are told in the papers that all the stuff about his wife and himself may be untrue. I hope it may prove so. I received a letter from Keyes this morning. I believe I wrote you that I had. How hard it is that I cannot see and talk with you in this time of great, great trouble. I feel as if I had not a friend in the world save yourself. I sometimes wish myself out of this world of sorrow and care. I fear my fine articles at B.'s are getting pulled to pieces and soiled. I do not wish you to leave New York without having the finest articles packed up and returned to me. The single white camel's hair shawl and the 2 Paisleys I wish returned to me, if none of them are sold. Do you think there is the least chance of their being sold? I will give you a list of the articles I wish returned to me from Mr. Brady's before you leave New York for Washington. 1 camel's hair shawl, double black centre. 1 camel's hair shawl, double white centre. 1 single white camel's hair shawl. 2 Paisley shawls, white. 1 pair bracelets and diamond ring. 1 fine lace handkerchief. 3 black lace shawls. 2 black llama shawls. 1 dress, silk unmade, white and black. 1 white boa. 1 Russian sable boa, 1 Russian sable cape, 1 A sable cape cuffs and muff, 1 chinchilla set. The lace dress, flounce, and shawl, if there is no possibility of their being sold. Also all other fine articles return me, save the dresses which, with prices lowered, may be sold. M. L. Chicago, November 15, '67. My dear Keckley, your last letter has been received, and believe me, I duly appreciate your great interest in my affairs. I hope the day may arrive when I can return your kindness in more than words. As you are aware of my beloved husband's great indulgence to me in pecuniary matters, thereby allowing me to indulge in bestowing favors on those whom I considered worthy of it, it is in this respect I feel chiefly the humiliation of my small circumscribed income. If Congress or the nation had given me the 4 years' salary, I should have been able to live as the widow of the great President Lincoln should, with sufficient means to give liberally to all benevolent objects, and at my death should have left at least half of it to the freedmen, for the liberty of whom his precious sacred life was sacrificed. The men who prevented this being done by their villainous, unscrupulous falsehoods are no friends of the colored race, and, as you well know, have led Johnson on in his wicked course. God is just, and the day of retribution will come to all such, if not in this world, in the great hereafter, to which those hoary-headed sinners are so rapidly hastening with an innocent conscience. I did not feel it necessary to raise my weak woman's voice against the persecutions that have assailed me emanating from the tongues of such men as Weed and Company. I have felt that their infamous false lives was a sufficient vindication of my character. They have never forgiven me for standing between my pure and noble husband and themselves, when for their own vile purposes they would have led him into error. All this the country knows, and why should I dwell longer on it? In the blissful home where my worshipped husband dwells, God is ever merciful, and it is the consolation of my broken heart that my darling husband is ever retaining the devoted love which he always so abundantly manifested for his wife and children in this life. I feel assured his watchful, loving eyes are always watching over us, and he is fully aware of the wrong and injustice permitted his family by a country he lost his life in protecting. I write earnestly because I feel very deeply. It appears to me a very remarkable coincidence that most of the good feeling regarding my straitened circumstances proceeds from the colored people, in whose cause my noble husband was so largely interested. Whether we are successful or not, Mr. F. Douglass and Mr. Garnet will always have my most grateful thanks. They are very noble men. If any favorable results should crown their efforts, you may well believe at my death, whatever sum it may be, will be bequeathed to the colored people, who are very near my heart. In yesterday's paper it was announced that Governor Andrews' family were having $100,000 contributed to them. Governor A. was a good man, but what did he do compared to President Lincoln? Right and left the latter gave when he had but little to bestow, and in consequence his family are now feeling it. Yet for my life I would not recall a dollar he ever gave. Yet his favorite expression, when I have playfully alluded to the rainy day that might be in store for himself and his own, on several occasions, he has looked at me so earnestly and replied, "Cast your bread upon the waters." Although the petty sum of $22,000 was an insufficient return for Congress to make me, an allowance to its meagreness by men who traduced and vilified the loved wife of the great man who made them, and from whom they amassed great fortunes, for Weed and Seward and R. did this last. And yet all this was permitted by an American people, who owed their remaining a nation to my husband. I have dwelt too long on this painful subject, but when I have been compelled from a pitiful income to make a boarding-house of my home, as I now am doing, think you that it does not rankle in my heart? Fortunately, with my husband's great love for me, the knowledge of this future for his petted and idolized wife was spared him, and yet I feel in my heart he knows it all. Mr. Sumner, the intimate friend of better days, called to see me 2 or 3 weeks since. He who had been an habitué of the White House, both the rooms of the President and my own reception-room. In either place he was always sure of a heartfelt welcome. My present situation must have struck a painful chord in his noble sympathizing heart, and yet when I endeavored to ameliorate my condition, the cry has been so fearful against me as to cause me to forget my own identity, and suppose I had plundered the nation indeed and committed murder. This certainly cannot be America, the land of the free, the home of the brave. The evening before Mr. Sumner's last call, I had received Mr. Douglas's letter. I mentioned the circumstance to Mr. Sumner, who replied, "Mr. Frederick Douglass is a very noble, talented man, and I know of no one who writes a more beautiful letter. I am sending you a long letter, Lizzie, but I rely a great deal on your indulgence. My fear is that you will not be able to decipher the scrawl written so hastily. I remain truly yours, Mary Lincoln." Chicago, November 17. My dear Lizzie, by the time you receive this note you will doubtless find the papers raving over the large income which we are each said to have. Knowing exactly the amount we each will have, which I have already informed you, I was going to say I have been shocked at the fabulous sum set down to each, but I have learned not to be surprised at anything. Of course it is gotten up to defeat success. You will now see the necessity for those circulars being issued weeks since. I enclose you a scrap from yesterday's Times of C, marked No. 1, also No. 2, today's Times. The sum of $11,000 has been subtracted in 24 hours from the same paper. If it continues for a few days longer, it will soon be right. It is a secesh paper, says Congress gave me $25,000 as a present, besides $20,000 of remaining salary. The $25,000 you know to be utterly false. You can show this note to B. and K., also the scraps sent. Let no one see them but themselves, and then burn them. It is all just as I expected, that when the division took place a mountain would be made of a molehill, and I fear it will succeed in injuring the premeditated plans. If the war rages, the Evening News might simply say that the sum assigned each was false, that $75,000 was the sum the administrator, Judge Davis, filed his bonds for. But by all means my authority must not be given, and then the Evening News can descant on the $25,000 each, with income of $1,700 each, and Mrs. Lincoln's share, she not being able to touch any of her son's portion. My word or testimony must not appear in the article, only the paper must speak decidedly. It must be managed very judiciously, and without a day's delay. Yours truly, M. L. November 17. Private for yourself. Lizzie, show the note enclosed with this to B. and K. Do not let them retain it an instant after reading, nor the printed articles. I knew these falsehoods would be circulated when the estate was divided. What has been the cause of the delay about the circulars? I fear, between ourselves, we have reason to distrust those men. Whatever is raised by the colored people, I solemnly give my word at my death it shall all, every cent, be returned to them. And out of the sum, if it is $50,000, you shall have $5,000 at my death, and I cannot live long, suffering as I am now doing. If $25,000 is raised by your people, you shall have the sum at my death, and in either event, the $25,000 raised, or $50,000, I will give you $300 a year, and the promised sum at my death. It will make your life easier. I have more faith in F.D.'s and G.'s efforts than in B. and K., I assure you. This division has been trumped up just now through spite. I have written to Judge Davis for an exact statement, which I will send to you when received. Write if anything is doing. Truly, M. L. Chicago, November 21. My dear Lizzie, your letter of Tuesday is just received. I have just written B. a note of thanks for his kindness, also requesting the articles of which I gave you a list. Do see Keyes about it. K. will have it done. And will you see that they are forwarded to me before you leave New York? K. sent me a telegram on yesterday that 8 names were on the circulars, and that they would be sent out immediately. What success do you think they will have? By all means assure K. and B. I have great confidence in them. These circulars must bring some money. Your letter made me quite sad. Talk to K. and B. of the grateful feelings I express towards them. Do pet up B. and see my things returned to me. Can you not, dear Lizzie, be employed in sewing for some of your lady friends in New York until December 1st? If I ever get any money you will be well remembered, be assured. R. and a party of young men leave for the Rocky Mountains next Monday, to be absent 3 weeks. If the circulars are sent out, of course the blasts will be blown over again. So R is out of the way at the time, and money comes in, I will not care. Write the hour you receive this. I hope they will send out 150,000 circulars. Urge K and B to do this. Your friend, M. L. Saturday morning, November 23rd. My dear Lizzie, although I am suffering with a fearful headache to-day, yet as your note of Wednesday is received, I must write. I am grieved to find that you are so wretchedly low-spirited. On Wednesday, the 20th of November, K. sent me the telegram I send you. If he is not in earnest, what does it mean? What is the rate of expenses that B. has gone to in my business, that he dares to withhold my immense amount of goods? Do you believe they intend sending out those circulars? Of course you will be well rewarded if we have any success, but as to $500 now, I have it not for myself or any one else. Pray what does B. propose to charge for his expenses? I pray God there will be some success, although, dear Lizzie, entirely between ourselves, I fear I am in villainous hands. As to money, I haven't it for myself just now, even if nothing comes in. When I get my things back, if ever, from I will send you some of those dresses to dispose of at Washington for your own benefit. If we get something, you will find that promises and performance for this life will be forthcoming. It is mysterious why B. never writes, and K. once perhaps in 3 weeks. All this is very strange. M. L. Chicago, Sunday, November 24th. My dear Lizzie, I wrote you on yesterday, and am aware it was not a pleasant letter. Although I wrote what I fear will turn out to be truths, it will be 2 weeks to-morrow since the legally attested consent from me was received by B. and K., and yet names have not been obtained for it when last heard from. However, we will soon see for ourselves. If you and I are honest in our motives and intentions, it is no reason all the world is so. If I should gain nothing pecuniarily by the loud cry that has been made over my affairs, it has been a losing game indeed, and the laugh of the world will be against me if it turns out as I now think. There is no doubt it will be all failure. If they had issued those circulars when they should have done, before the election, then it would have been all right. Alas, alas, what a mistake it has all been! I have thought seriously over the whole business, and know what I am about. I am grateful for the sympathy of Mr. F. Douglas and Mr. Garnet. I see that F. D. is advertised to lecture in Chicago some time this winter. Tell him for me, he must call and see me. Give him my number. If I had been able to retain a house, I should have offered him apartments when he came to see. As it is, I have to content myself with lodgings. An ungrateful country this. I very much fear the malignity of Seward, Weed, and R. will operate in Congress the coming winter, and that I will be denounced there, with their infamous and villainous falsehoods. The father of wickedness and lies will get those men when they pass away, and such fiends as they are always linger in this mortal sphere. The agitation of mind has very much impaired my health. Why was not I taken when my darling husband was called from my side? I have been allowed no rest by those who in my desolation should have protected me. How dearly I should love to see you this very sad day! Never, dear Lizzie, think of my great nervousness the night before we parted. I had been so harassed with my fears. Always yours, M. L. December 26. My dear Lizzie, your letter is just received. I have just written to K. to withdraw the C. Go to him yourself the moment you receive this. The idea of Congress doing anything is ridiculous. How much could effect if he chose through others? Go to B. and K. the moment you receive this. Yours, M. L. Chicago, December 27. Dear Lizzie, I wrote you a few lines on yesterday. I have twice written to Mr. K. to have the C. stopped. Go and see him on the subject. I believe any more newspaper attacks would lay me low. As influence has passed away from me with my husband, my slightest act is misinterpreted. Time makes all things right. I am positively suffering for a decent dress. I see Mr. A. and some recent visitors eyeing my clothing askance. Do send my black merino dress to me very soon. I must dress better in the future. I tremble at the bill that B. and K. may send me. I am so illy prepared to meet any expense. All my articles not sold must be sent to me. I leave this place early in the spring. Had you better not go with me and share my fortunes for a year or more? Write. Yours, etc., M.L. Clifton House, January 12. My dear Lizzie, your last letter was received a day or two since. I have moved my quarters to this house, so please direct all your letters here. Why did you not urge them not to take my goods to Providence? For heaven's sake, see K and B when you receive this, and have them immediately returned to me with their bill. I am so miserable I feel like taking my own life. My darling boy, my Tatty alone, I fully believe, prevents the deed. Your letter announcing that my clothes (Footnote C. The clothes that I have given for the benefit of Wilberforce College, they have been deeded to Bishop Payne, who will do with them as he thinks best, for the cause to which they are dedicated. The letter on page 366 will explain more fully.) End footnote. Were to be paraded in Europe, those I gave you, has almost turned me wild. R. would go raving distracted if such a thing was done. If you have the least regard for our reason, pray write to the Bishop that it must not be done. How little did I suppose you would do such a thing! You cannot imagine how much my overwhelming sorrows would be increased. May kind Heaven turn your heart and have you write that this exhibition must not be attempted. R. would blast us all if you were to have this project carried out. Do remember us in our unmitigated anguish, and have those clothes, worn on those fearful occasions, recalled. I am positively dying with a broken heart, and the probability is that I shall be living but a very short time. May we all meet in a better world where such grief is unknown. Write me all about yourself. I should like you to have about 4 black widow's caps, just such as I had made in the fall in New York, sent to me. Of course you would not suppose if I had you come out here and work for me 6 weeks, I would not pay your expenses, and pay you as you made each dress. The probability is that I shall need few more clothes. My rest, I am inclined to believe, is near at hand. Go to B&K and have my clothes sent me without further publicity. I am feeling too weak to write more to-day. Why are you so silent? For the sake of humanity, if not me and my children, do not have those black clothes displayed in Europe. The thought has almost whitened every hair of my head. Write when you receive this. Your friend, M.L. New York City, January 1st, 1868. Bishop Payne, D.D. Dear Sir, allow me to donate certain valuable relics to be exhibited for the benefit of Wilberforce University, where my son was educated, and whose life was sacrificed for liberty. These sacred relics were presented to me by Mrs. Lincoln after the assassination of our beloved President. Learning that you were struggling to get means to complete the college that was burned on the day our great emancipator was assassinated, prompted me to donate in trust to J.P. Ball, agent for Wilberforce College, the identical cloak and bonnet worn by Mrs. Lincoln on that eventful night. On the cloak can be seen the life blood of Abraham Lincoln. This cloak could not be purchased from me, though many have been the offers for it. I deemed it too sacred to sell, but donate it for the cause of educating the 4 millions of slaves liberated by our President, whose private character I revere. You well know that I had every chance to learn the true man, being constantly in the White House during his whole administration. I also donate the glove. Footnote D. I have since concluded to retain the glove as a precious souvenir of our beloved President. End footnote. Worn on his precious hand at the last inaugural reception. This glove bears the marks of thousands who shook his hand on that last and great occasion. This and many other relics I hope you will receive in the name of the Lincoln Fund. I also donate the dress worn by Mrs. Lincoln at the last inaugural address of President Lincoln. Please receive these from your sister in Christ, L. Keckley. Clifton House, January 15th, 1868. My dear Lizzie, you will think I am sending you a deluge of letters. I am so very sad to-day that I feel that I must write you. I went out last evening with Tad on a little business in a street car, heavily veiled, very imprudently having my month's living in my pocket-book, and on return found it gone. The loss I deserve for being so careless, but it comes very hard on poor me. Troubles and misfortunes are fast overwhelming me. May the end soon come. I lost $82 and quite a new pocket-book. I am very, very anxious about that bill B&K may bring in. Do go, dear Lizzie, and implore them to be moderate, for I am in a very narrow place. Tell them, I pray you, of this last loss, as they have not been successful, between ourselves, and only given me great sorrow and trouble. I think their demand should be very small. Do not mention this to them. Do, dear Lizzie, go to 609 and talk to them on this subject. Let my things be sent to me immediately, and do see to it that nothing is left behind. I can afford to lose nothing they have had placed in their hands. I am literally suffering for my black dress. Will you send it to me when you receive this? I am looking very shabby. I hope you have entirely recovered. Write when you receive this. Very truly yours, M.L. Chicago, February 7. Mr. Brady, I hereby authorize Mrs. Keckley to request my bill from you, also my goods. An exact amount must be given of everything, and all goods unsold returned to me. Pray hand Mrs. Keckley my bill without fail immediately. Respectfully, Mrs. Lincoln. Saturday, February 29. Dear Lizzie, I am only able to sit up long enough to write you a line and enclose this check to Mr. K. Give it to him when he gives you up my goods, and require from him an exact inventory of them. I will write you to-morrow. The hour you receive this, go to him, get my goods, and do not give him the check until you get the goods, and be sure you get a receipt for the check from him. In his account given 10 days since, he said we had borrowed $807. Now he writes for $820. Ask him what this means, and get him to deduct the $13. I cannot understand it. A letter received from K. this morning says if the check is not received the first of the week, my goods will be sold, so do delay not an hour to see him. My diamond ring, he writes, has been sold. The goods sold have amounted to $824, and they appropriate all this for their expenses. A precious set, truly. My diamond ring itself cost more than that sum, and I charged them not to sell it under $700. Do get my things safely returned to me. Truly, M.L. Transcriber's note: every effort has been made to replicate this text as faithfully as possible, including obsolete and variant spellings. End of Appendix. Recording by Michelle Day. End of Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley.